Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 343. It is of course the Patreon Drydock at the end of March, so buckle up, there's a lot of questions to be answered, and we're going to start now. Nick Brodar asks, US Navy supporters used the South American battleships to push the creation of the new Steel Navy. Were these ships an actual threat or just fear-mongering? Well, it depends what you mean by actual threat. So this is the Riachuelo, the Brazilian ironclad that kicked everything off. Now, in and of itself, was it a threat? Well, what were some of the statements made? There's the US Senator who essentially says, well, this thing could park itself in any US port and it could demolish the entire US Navy and there's nothing really that we could do to stop it. Technically speaking, he was correct. The Riachuelo was faster, better armed, and better armoured than anything the US Navy had in its inventory at that point. Although sailing into harbour and laying waste to the entire US Navy was probably a little bit of an overstatement, because of course in the confined waters of a harbour, sheer mass would allow some US ships to get close enough to board, and after all, the rate of fire on something like Riachuelo is not going to be that high. But certainly if she was to, say, conduct a one-ship blockade of New York Harbour by standing outside of it, for example, perhaps with some cruisers to do the commerce interdiction part, then yeah, she could pretty much take on all comers as they came out, up until, I guess, she ran out of ammo. But that rather misses two rather big points. Firstly, of course, did Brazil have any interest in actually going to war with the United States? Not really. And secondly, Riachuelo is still only one ship. So yes, Riachuelo and some supporting ships could cause absolute havoc if, for some bizarre reason, Brazil decided it was going to start beating up the United States and deployed off one of its major ports. But that means the US has lots of other ports which could, in theory, continue to conduct trade. And yes, the Brazilian Navy does have a few other ships that they could send to try and blockade those ports, but most of the other ships of the Brazilian Navy are within the capabilities of the US Navy to deal with. So, from a purely technical perspective, was Riachuelo superior to anything in the US Navy? Yes. Did that actually mean anything in terms of Brazil going to war with the US Navy and blockading it? No. Could a full alliance, as unlikely as that would ever be, of all the South American countries ganging up on the US with their most modern ships cause problems? Yes, in theory. They had a few more ships that would have been difficult for the US Navy to deal with prior to the new Steel Navy. But just ask anyone who's even partially South American or vaguely familiar with South America just how likely it is to get Peru, Chile, Argentina, and Brazil to all ally on one thing. Yeah, that ain't happening. And secondly, even so, there would still be a lot more US ports than this hypothetical South American alliance would have difficult to destroy ships to blockade those ports with. So in terms of actually destroying the United States, it's basically fear-mongering. In terms of causing problems for the United States, or perhaps trying to extort it for something, there's a small possibility that that could have been a threat. Although it is somewhat ironic that when you read deeper into the whole discussion, an awful lot of it reads like a lot of US senators going, well, we sent over a small contingent of very difficult to deal with warships to Japan, sailed up to essentially their capital and threatened them with violence unless they did what we wanted. So technically, what's to stop anybody else with a powerful enough force coming up to, say, Washington, D.C. and doing the same thing? The irony, of course, being that they're projecting their own actions when they had a preponderance of strength versus Japan onto other people like Brazil, who, as far as I'm aware, in the 19th century, didn't really seem to bother all that much about whether or not they wanted to enact regime change in the United States. HMS Etc. asks, during the US Civil War, what were some of the naval operations and strategies of the European powers? Much of this, from an American perspective, is overshadowed by the brutal war and high-profile river actions, as well as the Union's Anaconda blockade of the South. In terms of direct naval conflicts, the primary and pretty much only major one, as far as Europe is concerned, is the Second Schleswig War between the Danes and the Prussians. But given that the American Civil War covers the first half of the 1860s, apart from direct naval battles, there are quite a lot of interesting developments occurring in Europe. Obviously, you start off with France and Britain introducing the ironclad in the form of Gloire and Warrior right before the American Civil War breaks out and the subsequent race between those two powers. But there's a huge amount of early technological development. So you have early experiments with making armoured frigates as well as armoured ships of the line, even if they don't have multiple gun decks unless you're Magenta and Solferino. That doesn't work out too well. You've got some of the early ironclads being converted from wooden ships as opposed to dedicated, as designed from the start, ironclads, both with wooden and iron hulls. You've got experiments with armor-piercing guns, which obviously now need to be developed. You've got a little bit of a scramble as everybody else tries to acquire ironclads, and if you can't afford a 10,000-ton top-of-the-line ironclad, you get a whole slew of smaller ironclads being deployed, which, although they don't have anything close to the firepower and capabilities of the big ones, like the Couronne and Warrior in Defence and so forth, they are still a absolutely massive threat to existing wooden ships of the line. Also, somewhat related to the US Civil War, the British get a little bit nervous partway through that the Union might use the fact that they're incredibly heavily militarized at this point to try and take a sideswipe at absorbing Canada as well as fighting the Confederacy. So, in the middle of the American Civil War, the British Empire actually sends a whole bunch of troops to Canada to guard it just in case, which interestingly sees the use of the SS Great Eastern as, instead of being an ocean liner, a gigantic troop ship, which is where a few pictures of the Great Eastern with cannon mounted aboard can be found. And there's a bunch of operations, small ones admittedly, but still, by various European powers to try and stop the American Civil War spilling over into their territories, in terms of being very strict about enforcing the laws of neutrality, patrols to keep actually ships of both sides out of their territorial waters. Rather famously, in the showdown between Kearsarge and Alabama, you have a rather superior French ironclad sitting at the edge of French territorial waters like a gigantic referee, essentially saying, look, you two can fight it out all you like, but you're going to do it that side of our territorial boundary. And if either of you dare come over this side and start shooting, well, vive la France and down with you lot. And it is quite funny, actually, because even combined, Kearsarge and Alabama would have stood zero chance against that French ironclad, which kind of put the whole conflict into a bit of perspective. And of course, you have various operations going on internally, because the Confederacy in particular makes lots of attempts to purchase ironclads and other warships from various nations. Some of them, like in fact the Alabama, work out for them. Others don't. They try a whole series of different measures, either pretending to be from another country to purchase a warship outright, or ordering a ship as a civilian vessel but fitted for but not with weaponry, and then ordering the weaponry separately, because some nations either from the start or initially turned around and said, look, we're not selling anybody a warship that might go to the Confederacy. And so you had these two tactics. Either you pretend to be, for example, Egypt, and then, oh, we're building a warship for Egypt, then as soon as it sails it magically gets transferred to the Confederacy, or you order a ship without weapons but is fitted for weapons, which even in the middle of the 19th century is not necessarily completely unknown for a civilian vessel. You sail that out of the selling power's territorial waters, and separately, you can buy a bunch of weapons as cargo, just not a warship, and then the ship that's carrying the weapons and the ship that needs the weapons meet up in mid-ocean, transfer them, and presto, you now have a warship. And depending on the sympathies of the country in question, depends on how successful all of this was. A few countries were happy to let private industry build whatever they wanted, and in the UK you had a slightly weird dichotomy in that some elements, especially in the upper echelons of British society and political circles, kind of wanted it to happen, but the general British public feeling was mostly that it shouldn't happen, which is why you saw most of the more interesting hoops being jumped through in British shipyards. Adam Schindler asks, were there ever any serious efforts to mount air or surface search radars on the Akron class airships? Sadly, no, largely on the grounds that Akron crashed 2 years before the US actually tested its first experimental radar system, and Macon crashed in the same year as that system was tested. So there physically couldn't be radar installed on them because they weren't around by the time the US actually had a radar system that was small enough and effective enough to be worth installing on anything other than a big ground installation. Although it should be noted that the K-class blimps that were used by the US in World War II were actually equipped with air-to-surface search radar sets. So, I mean, yeah, okay, a blimp is a slightly different thing from a gigantic rigid airship, but it did prove that in principle there wasn't too much of a problem hauling those sets around. The main difference would be that on a blimp, you have your big envelope and then just engines and the gondola. So, in terms of potential interference, you don't have much more than you would mounting an airborne radar on an aircraft, in fact, possibly slightly less. Whereas with a big rigid airship, there is the potential, if you don't shield or angle your radar set correctly, that you might get some kind of interference from, the gigantic metal structure that keeps the airship rigid. But that would be, in theory, also applicable to mounting, for example, H2S radar in a Lancaster bomber on a slightly smaller scale, admittedly, but the Lancaster is solid metal, whereas the airship is lattice. So if you were going to put either air-to-surface or air-to-air radar on a hypothetical surviving Akron-class airship, then you would have to install it in a very carefully chosen position. So perhaps underneath the gondola or on either side of the airship, perhaps adding an extra pod. As you can see here, you've got 4 pods for the engines on each side, so perhaps adding an extra pod projection out that way, or something of that nature. Robert Henry Ilston asked, you discussed in part 1 of Drydock 338 the minimum requirements for an officer's uniform or gear. What sort of punishment would an officer receive if he did not meet the standard? Let's say he was unable to repair or replace his uniform after an engagement or after a change of circumstance. Well, there's 2 very different situations there. If he was unable to repair or replace a uniform after an engagement, after a battle, then that wouldn't really be held against him because, well, a battle is incredibly unpredictable. If he's got wounded or someone else's body parts and fluids have been scattered over him during a battle, well, it sucks, but that's to be expected. And if, let's say, an enemy cannonball has taken his luggage with it and thus destroyed his spare uniforms, well, there physically isn't another spare uniform aboard because it's very unlikely that he will fit a uniform of one of his other officers. Now, if it was very, very close, he might arrange, in terms of fit, he might arrange to purchase a spare uniform from one of his officers, assuming they're still around, and then modify it perhaps with bits of his remaining uniform. So, the various rank signifiers and so forth. But that's not necessarily going to be expected of him. If he is 5'8" and his first lieutenant is 6'2", or vice versa, that's not really going to be held against him. But once the ship gets into a port where he can get either the materials or a uniform direct, he would be expected to then acquire that post haste. if he faced a change in circumstances financially and at that point couldn't afford to repair or replace a uniform, well, he would have to have a uniform if he wanted to remain in his or her Majesty's service. So at that point, you'd basically be expected to take out a loan or get it on credit, which wouldn't actually be that difficult because assuming that you were an employed naval officer, you actually have one of the steadier and more guaranteed income sources, assuming you don't die, of the period. So most tailors and so forth would probably be happy to advance you part of the cost of the uniform on credit because there's a reasonable chance that you're actually going to pay it back. F19A Ghost Rider asks, did any of the World War II navies experiment with using naval armor-piercing weapons, shells and aerial bombs, against hardened land targets such as runways or dug-in bunkers? And is this plausible? I've wondered if such technique might be possible for temporary runway damage on land bases or in a pre-amphibious bombardment such as at Omaha Beach or Iwo Jima. While armor-piercing shells were very occasionally used against some of the larger bunker complexes, the fundamental problem with using them wasn't their destructive capability, it was the accuracy of the guns, because even a very, very accurate naval gun that could deliver a salvo of, let's say, 8 shells in a 200 to 250 yard radius, well, that's all fine and good. Against a ship, against a bunker, there are very, very few bunkers that size. And that means that if you fire a bunch of AP rounds at your average bunker, unless you're talking about something that's toting, several battleship grade guns, the chances are they're going to miss. And when they do miss, they're just going to burrow into the surrounding rock or soil and then explode. Now, the explosive charge on board isn't something to be sniffed at, but if a naval AP shell goes off, let's say 20 yards away from a heavily fortified bunker, you're probably not going to fundamentally affect the internal workings of that bunker. Conversely, if you fire a high explosive round at that bunker, if you miss by 20 yards, the sheer amount of explosive plus the fact it's going to detonate much closer to the surface means that the bunker is going to know about it. Even if it's not breached, the shock effect of that explosion is going to seriously disrupt either the machinery or the people or both. And similarly, a direct hit by such a shell against a lot of bunkers that are more designed to withstand tank rounds and so forth, it might still blow open the bunker. And even if it doesn't, again, the shock and in that particular case, the spalling might still heavily disrupt things. So it's better to just shoot HE at them. Although, as I said, in some cases with particularly threatening and particularly large bunkers, AP was used because obviously if an armor-piercing shell does hit such a large and threatening bunker and penetrates, then, well, it's game over for the bunker, which is good. Against runways, it's actually much better to use high explosive shells because, yes, an airfield's runway is a relatively solid target, but when you're talking about lobbing projectiles that weigh either the better part of or slightly over a ton at them, yeah, they're not actually that hard in that case. And again, you'd face the problem of if you hit them with an AP round, the AP round's almost certainly just going to go straight through the runway surface, burrow underground and explode, probably not cause a huge amount of damage, and given that you're talking about World War II airfields, that's relatively easy to patch. Whereas if you fire a high explosive round, perhaps a base fused one, then that's going to hit, again, because of the way it's going to start to break up that surface, and then when it explodes, it's going to leave a much, much larger crater, which is going to be much, much more difficult for them to repair, which is kind of the point. In terms of aerial bombs, so naval AP bombs, 1,000-pounder, 1,600-pounder, etc., used by dive bombers, those were occasionally used against hardened shore targets, not airfields, for the similar reason it's better to just use large HE bombs against them in World War II. But for hardened targets ashore that an accurate dive bomber can hit, yes, they did occasionally use AP bombs there. Waldo739 asks, I can't remember if this has been asked before, but it's been stuck in the back of my mind for a while. Has anyone, for fun, calculated just how much shaft horsepower a standard class battleship, like a Tennessee or West Virginia, would need to get up to the speed of the Iowa class if they'd had their post-Pearl Harbor rebuilds? I don't know if anyone's gone in to calculate it specifically, but we do have a little bit of a clue when they were looking at potentially modernizing the North Carolinas and the South Dakotas in the Cold War to try and bring them up to, in the North Carolinas case, ideally Iowa type speed, so 33 knots. In the South Dakota's case, they accepted they were only going to make it up to 31 knots. But in both of those cases, they actually would need power plants, either in the North Carolina's case, slightly more powerful, in the South Dakota's case, substantially more powerful than that on the Iowa class, despite the Iowa class displacing a lot more, and that's simply because of their shorter hulls. Now, the reason I mention that is because while the North Carolinas needed less power, mostly because they had a longer hull, which obviously lends itself better to speed because of the whole hull speed issue, the South Dakotas are only about 30 feet or so longer than a Colorado, which in and of itself is somewhat longer than a Tennessee. So when you look at the South Dakotas, now obviously they do displace a little bit more as well, but they were looking at over 250,000 shaft horsepower to get a South Dakota up to 31 knots. And part of the reason this was dismissed as an option in both the South Dakotas and the North Carolinas was simply because you couldn't actually fit the propulsion machinery and power plant necessary, as well as also the stern form, into their hulls. You know, there was even removing the aft turret couldn't do it. Now, given that that's a ship with a hull that is slightly more optimized for high-speed travel and is a slightly longer hull, given the ratios between the North Carolina and the South Dakota, I would put a rough guesstimate that if you were going to take a Colorado and try and get it up to 31 knots, you're probably going to need something in the order of 280 to 300,000 shaft horsepower, if not more. Now, of course, you could alter that by giving it a bow extension, for example, making the hull somewhat longer, which would help matters. But you'd still be running into the issue, whether you with the bow extension or not, of there simply isn't enough hull volume in there to get the ship up to that kind of speed, unless you did something completely insane like rip out every single bit of the main armament and devote the entire hull plus bow extension to machinery and just had it as a gigantic high-speed AA barge with just 5-inch and 3-inch guns up top. Silder and Machine Works asks, you've mentioned before the reasoning given for not fitting US cruisers with torpedoes during World War II. However, were there any situations where having torpedoes might have been beneficial or even change the outcome of a battle? Now, granted, US cruisers didn't see quite as much peer-on-peer action through the course of the war as some other nations' cruisers did. Most of it was in the early part of the war, and then after that they were mostly just doing shore bombardment and carrier escort, largely thanks to a lack of existence by most Japanese cruisers, or they're just not being in the same part of the Pacific. Now, with that said, obviously you do have those early engagements, particularly Guadalcanal, and also one other which I'm going to pick up. So around Guadalcanal, I think there are a few cases where having torpedoes aboard cruisers might have been helpful. You've got things like obviously the first and second battles of Savo Island, or most of the Guadalcanal night actions, to be honest. They're all pretty close and tight, well within range of US torpedoes. And since torpedo launchers are a little bit faster to bring online than full turrets, you could have had situations like, say, In the first Battle of Sapphire Island, when Chicago, along with Canberra, was ambushed, given that Chicago managed to get away slightly, if she'd had, let's say, a quadruple torpedo launcher, she could have sent some torpedoes downrange and maybe taken out a Japanese ship or two. The biggest example was probably Callahan's night action, because the San Francisco got into knife fighting range with Hiei, and therefore was also well within torpedo range. So she could have potentially torpedoed the Japanese battle cruiser. Now, of course, there were a lot of US destroyers there with torpedoes, and there was some friendly fire involved. So, maybe it would have just been Atlanta got hit even harder, but it would potentially have been useful. The other one, which I think I would actually pick up, would be the Battle of the Komondorski Islands, where you have a small US formation led by Salt Lake City, along with the Omaha-class Richmond, in a running engagement with the Japanese. And the Japanese do fire torpedoes at the US formation, even though the US formation is fleeing, because they have very long-range torpedoes, so they're taking advantage of that. But while the actual gun ranges for most of the engagement are about a third again beyond the maximum range of the Mark 15 torpedo, which is the standard US surface launch torpedo for the period, the fact is the US formation is running, the Japanese formation is chasing, so if the torpedo's going one way and the Japanese are coming the other way, then they're actually probably going to meet around about the 10 to 12,000 yard period or range, which is actually well within the range of a Mark 15 set to run slow. And given that, well, pretty much most of the engagement was Salt Lake City, Richmond, and company running for their lives, although they did technically end up winning the engagement, if the Salt Lake City had had a torpedo battery, she could potentially have sent a bunch of torpedoes back down her path, which might have resulted in greater damage or potentially even destruction of some of the Japanese ships that were chasing her. But once you move past the Guadalcanal campaign and the Komondorski battle, at that point it would have been advisable to just land the torpedoes in exchange for more anti-aircraft guns, because there wasn't really much after that where they would have been of much use. DM Phoenix asks, the SMS Blucher, famously sunk at Dogger Bank, and HMS Dreadnought were contemporaries of each other, with the former being an armoured cruiser and the latter a full-on battleship. But comparing the two in specification, it's interesting to note that they are both around the same length and width, but Dreadnought is vastly superior in nearly every metric except for speed. Why was there such a massive disparity in capabilities between these two similar-sized ships of the era? It pretty much all comes down to that speed factor. Dreadnought does displace somewhat more than Blucher, but Blucher's maximum displacement at deep load is only marginally above Dreadnought's normal load displacement. But to be fair, most of that is made up of Dreadnought's significantly thicker protection armor. So internally and dimensionally wise, yeah, it's otherwise a valid question. Why is Blucher only rocking a dozen 8-inch or 8.3-inch guns, whereas Dreadnought drops gun numbers by 2 but is able to take 12 inches and so on and so forth? Well, as I say, it's mostly speed. There is a little bit to be said for the fact that Blucher's secondary battery is significantly casemated, which increases weight because the casements are armoured, as opposed to Dreadnought's secondaries, which at that point they're just 12-pounders, basically don't have much protection at all. So there's a little bit of additional weight going in for Blucher there, but it's mostly the speed. Blucher is faster, but to get that speed, she's using vertical triple expansion engines. And that means that not only does she need a larger machinery plant, just generally, whether she was using turbines or not, to hit the speed that she's designed for compared to the 21 knots of Dreadnought, she needs more machinery, therefore more weight devoted to machinery, therefore less weight can be devoted to armament and armor. But also, Dreadnought saved something, well, depending on which source you believe, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500 tons in machinery weight by switching from vertical triple expansion to turbine engines. So if you factor in the larger power plant you need to get up to 25 knots, you're probably comfortably looking at 1,500 tons or so possibly more excess weight in Blucher because of that choice to use vertical triple expansion engines compared to if you'd wanted a 25 knot Blucher with turbines. And given that we're talking about ships that are not breaking 20,000 tons, except in Dreadnought's case if you absolutely fully load it, I think that's probably where a lot of it goes. I mean, obviously, she's designed as an armoured cruiser, so she's never going to have battleship grade guns, but you could have done an awful lot more with her, either in potentially terms of armament or armament layout, because with more compact machinery spaces for turbines, you could potentially have put one or more of her wing turrets on the centerline and thus freed up space and weight that way, or given her more armor, or any number of other things. And you can kind of see this problem with the vertical triple expansion engine in the era of turbines reflected in other ways. So you look at the Nassau class, for example, they're actually slightly heavier than Dreadnought, a little bit shorter, but they're much, much slower. And because of the impact of that vertical triple expansion power plant, you end up having to carry 2 extra guns compared to Dreadnought, and their 11-inch guns are slightly smaller, for no additional increase in broadside firepower. Now, granted, they do have an inch more protection on the belt, but that really doesn't account for all their other shortcomings. And then you can look at the Helgolands. Again, they've got a little under an inch more belt armor. They have exactly the same broadside as Dreadnought, although again they're having to carry an additional pair of guns because of the space taken up by their triple expansion engines. And they're still not quite as fast as Dreadnought, despite having massively upgraded the power plant compared to the Nassaus. And their normal displacement is almost 23,000 tons compared to the just over 18,000 for Dreadnought. And, at a direct comparison of capabilities, that shows you how much additional weight you end up using because of directly the extra bulk and size of the vertical triple expansion power plant, and slightly indirectly the additional armament and the odd layout you have to use because of that same requirement. So yeah, it's almost entirely down to the power plant. TST1987 asks, if you were asked to command the following World War II battle cruiser or battle cruiser adjacent ships into battle, and you don't know what their real world eventual fate is going to be except for the fact they're going to face a gunnery action that they were designed for, would you prefer to take more guns or fewer but bigger guns in each of the following cases? So for the Scharnhorst class, would you prefer 911 or 6 15-inch guns? Definitely 6 15-inch guns, because the Scharnhorsts are quite quick. They're armoured in a manner that's, in the realm of a battleship, and 6 15-inch guns would give them a much better chance of standing up in a fight to a lot of even the older capital ships. The Renown class, 6 15-inch or 9 13.5-inch. Again, I would go for 6 15-inch. Now, 9 13.5-inch guns would be relatively nice in terms of striking power, but although they're adjacent to 14-inch guns, the 15-inch gun is a full-on battleship gun, and given when the Renown was designed, it was supposed to be going up against ships they thought would have 15-inch guns, and given the average caliber of everybody else, given her armor protection in World War II, if she's going up against other capital ships, at least at the lower end of things, the additional range and hitting power of the 15-inch gun is her ace in the hole. Whereas if she has 9 13.5-inch, then she's going to have to get a little bit closer to be able to reliably penetrate enemy ships, at which point the fact that she herself is not particularly well armored is probably going to come back to bite her. The Alaska class, 9 12-inch or 6 upgraded 14-inch, and this is presumably because the penetration of the 12-inch was almost as good as that of the 14. Now, in this case, I'm actually going to go with the 912-inch because part of the question is they're going to face the gunnery action they're designed for. And whereas the Scharnhorsts and Renowns were designed in part to face off against enemy capital ships, whether they would be battleships or battle cruisers, the Alaskas were designed as cruiser killers. And against enemy cruisers, both the 12-inch and the 14-inch have more than enough firepower, more than enough range, at which point the additional barrel count is just the more useful. The Dunkirk class, 8 13-inch guns or 6 15-inch guns. Now that one's quite difficult because if you look at Dunkirk's, at least in her original form as opposed to Strasbourg, speed and protection, if you go with the 6 15-inch guns, so presumably 2 triples instead of the 2 quad 13s, you're essentially getting a French version of Renown. And given that I've said previously Renown needs to have 15-inch guns, it would be a bit hypocritical of me to turn around and say, well, actually 8 13-inch guns, despite the fact they're pretty powerful guns, are good. But, I mean, well, the Dunkirk's firepower is pretty good anyway. Now, I think the question for me would come down to the gunnery action that they're designed for. The Dunkirks are designed to deal with the Deutschlands and potentially the Italian Cavours and Duilios. In that respect, the penetration power of the 13-inch gun is actually more than sufficient, and similar to the Alaskas, then more barrels is better. But given that the Dunkirks then end up entering service in a world where the Scharnhorsts exist, and potentially they might have to face off against the Littorios, the 6 15-inch guns, assuming we're going with Richelieu-style 15-inch guns, then becomes more tempting, especially because then they'd have a commonality of gun and ammunition with the Richelieus, which would be quite useful. So I'm very much on the fence. If I'm put in command of Dunkirk at the time that she is being launched or being designed, and told she's going to face the mission she is specifically designed for, i.e. Deutschland killer, then sure, stick with a 13-inch. But I think given the way things changed very quickly during her design process, if I've got any inkling of what the future holds, I would probably go with the 15-inch. Modernized Congo class, 8 14-inch or 6 16-inch in 3 twin turrets. Given that the Japanese were modernizing the Congos in an attempt to make them fast battleships, I would actually go with the 6 16-inch on paper for similar reasons to the Renown. It gives you firepower at a range where you can perhaps get away with the fact you don't have all that much protection. In their original battlecruiser format, the 8 14-inch is actually a better armament, but I do have some reservations as to whether or not you actually have the whole space and the whole strength to support twin 16-inch gun turrets, aka, turrets similar to those on Nagato and Mutsu. And so, while on paper, yes, that would be a good idea, in practice, I have my doubts whether you could actually mount that on a Congo hull. And finally, a modified hood, 8 15-inch or 6 18-inch, again in 3 twin turrets. This is probably outside of the Alaskas the one where I'm going to come down most definitively on the smaller one. So 8 15-inch guns is perfectly adequate. Those 15-inch guns are still capable of hurting pretty much anything she's likely to come across at decent range. And while the 18-inch would in theory have a longer range and better penetration, when you get to 18-inch guns, you are starting to look at a slowing of your rate of fire. And I'd also potentially have some questions about whether or not you could actually physically mount the things similar to the Congos. So with Hood, unless someone has leaked secret information about the capabilities of Yamato and you're trying to just very quickly modernize a long-range sniper to deal with her, outside of that, the 8 15-inch guns are actually perfectly fine for dealing with what she might come across. and therefore I would retain those. Daniel asks, what kind of escapades did US naval gun batteries get up to in World War One? Well, the whole story of the US naval gun batteries in World War One is actually very interesting, and something I do plan to cover in a future video. I'm compiling a short list of times that naval guns went ashore and effected some interesting changes in the land campaign, and I'm going to probably do that as a small series, maybe toward the end of the year, beginning of next. Now, in terms of the US gun batteries, this was actually a very interesting background because the Germans were shelling Dunkirk with some adapted naval guns from very long range. And the US, having just entered the war, decided they wanted to do something about that. They had a lot of 14-inch 50 caliber guns lying around because, well, that's what was on the latter or later standard battleships, and they were obviously manufacturing spare barrels for them. So they knew they had a lot of them, and they knew they could ship them as well because they'd already shipped 14-inch 45 caliber guns over to the UK, which had previously been ordered for the Greek battleship Salamis and were now installed on a bunch of monitors. But then they realised, well, it's all well and good being able to ship guns over. We need to actually ship everything else that you'd need for the guns. So they built 5 gun batteries and trains to go with them. So from scratch, entire trains for each gun battery, plus a 6th train, which was the command train, which doesn't often get mentioned. And of course, everything had to be built in the US to US specifications, but also had to work to the gauge and width restrictions of the French railway system, because obviously they were going to be based in France. And the idea was that each of these gun batteries would be a completely self-contained unit, so it could wander around and shoot at things without needing further support. The command train was basically to do general admin duty and to be the command area if more than one of the railway batteries was in the same place at the same time. So if you're interested, if you ever want to build such a thing for your model railway layout, you're going to need 1 locomotive, 1 gun car, which unsurprisingly is the thing with the 14-inch gun on it, a construction car, another construction car with a crane, a sand and log car, a fuel car, a kitchen car, 2 ammunition cars, 3 berthing cars, a battery headquarters car, a battery headquarters kitchen car, you've got to maintain the officer serving man to class distinction even on a train, and a workshop car. The command train is a little bit smaller. It has a staff quarters car, a staff kitchen car, a spare parts car, a construction car, a workshop car, a commissary car, and a berthing car. And there's actually a US Navy Institute Proceedings article that gives very detailed descriptions of exactly how each of the cars are laid out, especially the gun car. And the reason you needed the construction car is because while at lower elevations you could just park the train and fire the gun, if you elevated the gun up towards its maximum near 45-degree elevation, the recoil of the gun would pass through a space in the base of its gun car, and then if you didn't dig a big hole underneath, it would hit the ground. So that's the construction car allowed you to have all the equipment you needed to dig the big hole in the ground, so you didn't ruin the gun on your first shot. So the whole thing was conceptualized, designed, and construction ordered in just under a year. The construction of the guns and their trains was all completed by spring 1918, and they were shipped over to France, or started shipping over to France, by July, with the first train completed, obviously having been shipped partially disassembled, and ready to go by the 11th of August. Their first assigned mission was to try and take out the German Paris gun, but by the time the first 2 assembled batteries arrived in late August to a position where they could potentially fire on it, the Germans had actually withdrawn the gun, so Paris was saved either way. After that, the various guns were used against a variety of German targets just behind their lines, things like railroad heads, supply depots, ammunition dumps, basically the kind of thing that was just a little bit beyond the regular range of field artillery, but could still be hit from a naval gun battery that was safely behind Allied front lines. And generally speaking, they proved to be remarkably accurate weapons with quite a devastating impact on morale, not just because of their massive explosions, but because of the extent of the damage that they caused. Now, the damage, especially things like railroad tracks, could be repaired, but of course it significantly interrupted supplies, and there was nothing stopping the gun battery from just wrecking the repaired railroad once the Germans had finished working on it. The single biggest impediment to their use was actually the weather. The guns could fire in all weathers, fair enough, but a lot of the time they relied on aircraft reporting back the fall of shot, and if there was particularly heavy mist or high winds, then the aircraft found it very difficult, if not impossible, to actually observe the fall of shot. This wasn't to say that they went entirely without countermeasure. The Germans did try to engage the naval gun batteries with their own long-range guns and with the occasional aerial bombing attack, but for the most part, this, by luck or judgment, proved to be somewhat ineffective. A few near misses did cause minor damage to some of the train systems, and a few men were wounded, but none of the gun batteries were ever knocked out or suppressed by enemy counterfire. And then with the armistice, they were all shipped back home. Lord Druken asks, what were the immediate effects of the development and implementation of the U.S.S. Monitor and her successors? I'm going to assume you mean elsewhere in the world, because obviously their effect in the American Civil War is pretty known. The Confederates, well, they'd already built the Virginia, they just kept trying to build ironclads of their own. But elsewhere, people looked at what was being done in the US Civil War and they went, that's not necessarily a terrible idea. The European powers generally stuck to full-sized ironclad ships because they wanted, deep-water oceanic vessels for the most part, or if they were converting ships, they were generally converting other deep-water oceanic vessels anyway. But the idea of the Monitor, i.e. a floating armoured raft with some gun turrets on it, did strike a chord in two separate ways. Firstly, for nations that had extensive large rivers to defend. They were like, shallow draft, excellent. Armoured, well, that takes care of the problem we might face short-range gun batteries on either side of a river. Big guns, useful for taking on said gun batteries and anything else that's in range. And so a slew of river monitors, some of which look very similar to early US monitors, started construction almost immediately. The Leitha, as you can see here, is in Budapest, and that's one of the very earliest, which is why it looks so much like a US monitor. Of course, it was also adapted for coastal defense by some nations that had smaller navies, the Swedes, for example. And then you also had a kind of slightly larger hybrid successor, which was developed. So while they stuck, for the most part, as I said, with ocean-going ships, some of the larger European navies, such as the Royal Navy, decided that a shallow draft, low displacement, heavily armed and heavily armoured craft might be a useful harbour-coast protection vessel for areas where you kind of maybe wanted to have permanent protection by an armoured ship, but you didn't want the expense of tying down a full ocean-going ship there. And that would lead to the development of all sorts of different varieties of ship in various navies, but a good example would be the Cerberus, which was built for Australia, well, one of the states that would subsequently become Australia. And when you look at Cerberus, she does in many ways resemble an overgrown monitor, because that's essentially what she is. She's the monitor principal, but scaled up to be at least notionally seagoing without sinking in a storm, to allow her to transit initially from where she was built in the UK to Australia, and then subsequently, if needed, she could go to various different ports, but she was primarily designed as a harbour defence ship. And then you had various other successors and half-sisters and so forth. Some were built to defend Indian ports, for example. And of course, everybody also immediately started studying on what was the best way to defeat a monitor or a swarm of monitors, because if the powers with the bigger ocean-going ironclads decided they wanted to go and beat up on someone who had a small fleet of monitor-type vessels for their coast defence, well, then they needed to know how to get rid of them. And in that respect, the relatively speaking slow speed of most monitors was identified as their primary weak spot. Salami Sales Express asks, in the age of steam and steel, do you feel that warships were held back by metallurgy or pushed forward by metallurgy? I think it very much alternated. So if we start with the ironclad era, at that point, initially, warship design is pushed forward by metallurgy because the advent of iron hulls as opposed to wooden hulls allows you to build a much larger vessel. But then almost immediately you end up being limited by metallurgy because there are limits to what you can do with armor that is made of iron against ever increasingly powerful and larger guns. And that forces a very rapid transition in the space of, less than a couple of decades from high-sided, high-freeboarded, broadside and central battery ironclads down to the kind of squat floating bricks like the Admiral class here, this particular one being HMS Benbow. And then you start looking at, just to save weight, open barbettes for the guns, as you can see here. Then you end up with the Bessemer process allowing the mass production of iron and a few refinements to that, and suddenly steel is available, both as a armor material and a structural material, and now everything's being pushed forward by metallurgy. Now, that's not to say steel wasn't available before the Bessemer process, but it wasn't available in the kind of quantities and quality controlled reliability that you needed for battleship construction. So you're now being pushed forward by steel, especially then as metallurgy advances. You get Harvey steel and you get a return to high freeboard ships that can actually, cope with relatively heavy seas. And it also allows the production of longer barrel weapons, so weapons shrink down from the sort of 16.5 and 17-inch monsters of the late ironclad period down to the 11 and 12-inch guns that we're familiar with in most of the pre-Dreadnought period. And then things start growing again. And once you get into the 20th century, I don't think there's much of a push forward or held back either way. The metallurgy of armor plate is continuing to advance and will continue to advance all the way up to World War II, but the thickness of armor required to deal with the guns in question is pretty much available, even if you have to make a few small sacrifices here and there. What's really beginning to limit capital ships as you go through the late 1910s into the 20s and 30s, apart from treaties, is the fact that machinery for automation, especially for loading, is now a little bit behind. And that's not so much to do with metallurgy, that's to do with automation technology. There is one last area, I would say in the 1920s, when metallurgy is holding back shipping a little bit in certain countries, because you get things like the French early heavy cruisers, where the French steel industry hasn't kept up with latest practice, and therefore they're forced to build this essentially almost unarmored heavy cruisers just to meet the speed and firepower requirements. But then once they catch up, then obviously they're able to churn out something like Algerie. So at that point, it's more a case of the metallurgy industry, generally speaking, and the warship industry kind of pacing each other by the end. Physical Removal Enthusiast asks, why didn't submarine deck guns have gun shields like anti-tank guns had on land? It would protect them against small arms fire, which would theoretically be the biggest threat to a submarine which is engaging anything with its gun. Would the detrimental effects to underwater speed be so bad that it wouldn't have been worth it? Well, it's a combination of speed, weight, and size. You see, the problem with deck guns, or as in the case of the L class you can see here, conning tower guns, is that they're generally single weapons. So if you put some kind of gun shield on it, if you make it nice and big and flat, like you get on a lot of land-based anti-tank guns, you've basically put a gigantic water break on the top of your submarine, which isn't good. It's going to reduce your speed underwater. Also, if you're going to make it anything other than just basic splinter proof, it's going to be fairly heavy, especially if it's going to be big enough to shield all your crew. And top weight on a submarine, which generally speaking, doesn't displace all that much, is not a good thing. I mean, the submarine's already a pretty unstable gun platform anyway, with quite a heavy roll. The last thing you want to be doing is sticking unnecessary weight up there. And then you get to the size element, which is that, yes, in theory, although it would weigh more, it is possible to have a more hydrodynamically friendly fairing to make up your gun shield, which would reduce or hopefully minimize the impact on speed. You would still have the weight issue, in fact, I say more so because it's now got to extend further back and be curved and all of this. But that then comes back to what kind of gun you're using, because most submarine deck guns tend to be 3, 4, maybe occasionally 5-inch, and they almost are always single. And obviously, anti-aircraft guns are smaller. And if you have such a gun shield, and we're not going into whether or not you're going to make it dual purpose and have a massive cut up the middle anyway, but if you have it faired to the top of the hull, you're almost certainly going to be massively cutting into the operational space that the gun crew need to actually work the gun relatively quickly. And given that you only have one, maybe two, but usually just the one deck gun in a vessel that really, really cannot afford to take any hits, you need that gun to be firing as fast as humanly possible. And if you've cramped it all up by putting some kind of long lozenge-shaped fairing on it, you might as well not have bothered. Plus, also, any kind of gun fairing that has any substantial length to it runs the risk of actually impeding people's access to the gun, period, let alone, the cramped operational environment. And that's why, generally speaking, you will only tend to see some kind of gun shield or fairing on larger guns on ships like the M-class, Surcouf, X1, etc. Basically, when the gun is big enough that a faired gun shield won't impede the operation of the gun, or in the case of X1, where you have a twin mounting, and therefore, again, the mounting is large enough to not impede the operation of the guns, plural in that case, that's when you tend to see it. Ed asks, what was the actual mission role of World War II combatants that were smaller than destroyers? Were corvettes, sloops, destroyer escorts, etc. just mini destroyers that were built because there wasn't enough money to build more full-size destroyers? Or did they have their own distinct purposes in the Allied force structure? Partially, it was about cost, but there were also a lot of other considerations as to why you'd build a corvette, a sloop, a destroyer escort, etc., etc. Some of it pre-war was treaty restrictions, particularly with sloops, but other parts of it were infrastructure. There were only so many yards that could build a modern 1800, 2200, 2200 ton destroyer, etc. But there were a lot more yards that could build an 800, 900, 1100 ton ship, especially if it was built more to mercantile spec than warship spec. So if you had maxed out your destroyer production capacity and you needed still more escorts, well, then you had to build corvettes, sloops, destroyer escorts, escort destroyers, and those are two separate things, etc., etc. Plus, there are other economies like number of crew, because a full-size fleet destroyer needs a certain number of crew. Well, if you have issues training and maintaining and paying for that much manpower, well, then you can potentially run more escorts using smaller ships that require less crew. And that's before we get into things like other industrial bottlenecks, such as the availability of geared sets for geared turbines. So there are a lot of overall economic factors that dictate the use of these smaller escort types, but it's not just simple money. There are actually some rather hard limits on what various World War II powers can build in terms of full fleet destroyers. But beyond that, as I said, there are specific mission profiles, because when you look at how these various ships are used, you have to consider what is the likely opposition, because a destroyer, a full fleet destroyer that is, has to be a jack of all trades. It's got to be an anti-capital ship vessel because it's got torpedoes. It's got to be able to take on pier ships because it's got a whole battery of 4, 4.5, 4.75 inch, whatever, deck guns. It's also got to be an anti-aircraft escort, both for itself and for other ships in the fleet. It's got to be an anti-submarine escort for itself and other ships in the fleet. It's got to be fast enough to reposition itself in a fleet that's getting increasingly quick. So it's also got to be quite a bit of a speed demon, and so on and so forth. Not all of those things are required for escorting slow merchant convoys. You don't generally need massive anti-aircraft firepower to escort a convoy. You don't need particularly high speed. What you need is a platform which can carry depth charges and other later on anti-submarine weapons with a limited surface engagement capability in case a submarine comes to the surface, a self-defense AA capability just in case the occasional long-range patrol aircraft shows up, and the speed to be able to track down enemy submarines, which of course are, for the most part, somewhat limited in their surface and submerged speed compared to full-on warships. And if that's all you need, then putting a destroyer into that role, a full fleet one, is actually putting far too much resource to solve one very particular problem. Now, of course, as I said, the destroyer can do that, but the risk-reward is somewhat unfavorable compared to using any one of those smaller escort types. And some of those smaller escort types actually do have advantages over fleet destroyers. They might be more maneuverable, for example, or in the case of some of the U.S. Destroyer escorts with their diesel-electric drives, they're actually far faster to respond to commands to accelerate, decelerate, and also they can creep a lot quieter than a destroyer, which actually makes them better for hunting submarines. And similarly, because you don't necessarily need the colossal anti-capital ship firepower that is represented by 10 or 12 torpedoes, and you don't need an absolutely massive anti-aircraft battery, most of your escorts, as opposed to destroyers, can also fit substantially more anti-submarine weaponry, both per ton and in absolute terms, than most of your destroyers can. So there is definitely a need for your kind of smaller anti-submarine dedicated type escort vessel, as opposed to just churning out standard destroyers. Bill Brockman asks, watching your discussion on the difficulties with automatic 3-inch and larger guns, I wondered if liquid or gaseous propellant could be a useful thing. Then you'd only need to mechanically load the projectile, then inject the propellant similar to the fuel in an internal combustion engine cylinder. I imagine it's been considered and rejected for valid reasons. Yeah, it's been tried, mostly in the Cold War, but not so much prior to that. But it's almost universally ended in failure when you're talking about guns at an artillery scale. And there's a whole load of reasons for that. The primary one is that you can't technically guarantee exactly what your charge is with every single shot, and that's going to get worse in the Second World War and previously when you've got even less reliable and precise technology, because essentially what you need to do is inject the propellant once the breech is closed. Now that generates its own problem because that means you've now got a separate access into the breech air volume of the gun, which in and of itself now needs to be pressure proofed against the firing pressure of the gun. Otherwise you're just at best going to blow that connection. At worst it's going to detonate and you're going to have a whole load of burning propellant shoot out into the turret. But assuming you can overcome that, and in theory you can, you've got a given amount of liquid sloshing around inside, potentially with air bubbles, potentially not entirely filling the chamber, and therefore every shot is going to have a slightly different burn profile, which at best is going to affect where exactly that shell is going to go. At worst, it could cause some interesting pressure spikes and then the gun explodes. You could, in theory, have it so that the chamber is notionally filled and pressurized every time, but that just leads to further issues because you've now got to ensure a completely liquid tight seal for both breech and which is easy enough to do, I suppose, but also for the shell itself. And you still might have bubble issues, and you've got to have some kind of air vent to allow the air out, and you've got to have that positioned in such a way that at whatever angle you're loading it, the air can vent, because obviously if you put it in the wrong place, you might have an air pocket build up when you elevate the gun to a high angle. And you also have the additional problem of you now have a vent line or a fuel line essentially for propellant running all the way up to the turret, and given how fast you want the automatic guns to be firing, you can't really afford to inject a given amount of fuel, then purge the entire thing every time the gun is fired, and then refill it again, you're going to have to basically keep it constantly pressured and fueled, which means anything that goes wrong or any hit you receive, you now have a pressurized line of probably toxic, but definitely flammable propellant, which could be very easily severed, and that's going to do bad things to the interior of the turret, if not the rest of the ship. And it also further complicates what you do in the event of a misfire, because, I mean, a misfire on an artillery grade gun, whether it be a 3-inch or a battleship gun, is dangerous enough in and of itself. But in theory, you can, after leaving the gun to cool for sufficiently long, open up the breech and start fishing out whatever bits of the propellant charge and so forth are still around that might have caused the misfire. If you have a liquid propellant, and for some reason there's a misfire, well, you're going to be dumping a bunch of liquid propellant into your turret one way or the other. You better hope you got a really nice bucket. Tancodromis asks, would it be possible to make a VT fuse for county-class 8-inch guns, and what effect would this anti-aircraft capable 8-inch gun with VT fuse have had? Were there any other anti-aircraft capable but not particularly successful heavy guns which could have benefited from VT fuses? Well, I'm pretty sure the World War II Japanese would have taken your arm off to have a VT fuse fitted to the Type 3 shells that they had in their battleship grade anti-aircraft shells. Well, it's the World War II Japanese. They'll probably take your arm off anyway, shortly followed by the rest of your limbs. But never mind. In any case, going over to the county class, as you can see, they had a pretty high elevation for their 8-inch guns, at least initially. Could you make a VT shell for them? Yes, absolutely. VT fuses fitted on a 5-inch round. There's absolutely no reason why they wouldn't fit on an 8-inch round. Would it actually be useful? That's a much bigger question. One of the many reasons why they decided not to issue anti-aircraft shells in 8-inch for the county class, even though they designed the guns to be capable of it, was that, well, it's an 8-inch twin turret. Its tracking speed is not particularly suitable for the engagement of fast-moving aircraft. And partly because of that, no one bothered to develop an anti-aircraft fire control system that could work with it. But in theory, by the time you get to the Second World War, it shouldn't be too difficult to essentially program, for lack of a better term, a anti-aircraft fire control system to include parameters for the 8-inch gun. And with the range that you would be achieving with the 8-inch gun, at that point the speed of aircraft might not matter quite so much. I mean, if they're coming generally for you anyway, then you could pop off some rounds at long range with VT fuses. Hopefully they explode somewhere in or near the enemy aircraft, and that would have a disruptive effect for certain. I mean, that's a pretty hefty shell, so loaded up with shrapnel and explosive, if you've got a column of aircraft or a pattern of twin-engine aircraft or something like that, yeah, there would be a certain amount of utility to that. However, of course, it is still a manually loaded 8-inch gun. You're not going to get that many rounds off before the enemy aircraft get close enough that their speed becomes a rate of bearing change that the guns just can't keep up with. You potentially might also have issues with the blast of the guns then beginning to interfere with the operation of smaller caliber weapons, which might be more useful at that closer range. So there would be a certain benefit, but it would be within a very specific parameter. But the other issue you might actually face is that by the time the VT fuse and appropriate fire control equipment is available for the 8-inch gun, and just more generally, the range that you can engage with your 8-inch heavy artillery that's above and beyond that which you could achieve with your secondary battery, 4 or 5-inch guns, depending on the ship, that might be a space that's already occupied by your combat air patrol. So there might not be all that much utility to it anyway. Although, going a bit sideways, you might have a role for proximity fused 8-inch shells in a shore bombardment role. At that point, that might actually be very useful for air bursting 8-inch shrapnel shells right over the heads of enemy troops. The Hand of Ray asks, I, like many others who watch your fine channel, am familiar with World of Warships. So I was wondering, could you tell us a few of your favourite paper ships for whatever reason? So, paper ships in World of Warships for me, I tend to appreciate them on for two different reasons. So two different types of paper ship. One will be this was an actual, fully fleshed out, ready to go design that's actually quite good, and I like playing with them. And the other is this is just hilariously funny. And in the latter category, you can have some historical ones, but also some of the less historical paper ships as well. So, broadly speaking, I would say in terms of ships I like to play because I like both the gameplay and the fact that they're an alternate version, an alternate history version of something that was actually properly designed up. I really like the Minotaur and technically the Edgar, the Tier 11 version of it. The Plymouth, I'm in two minds of which of the two I prefer. I have vastly more experience with the Minotaur because the Minotaur's been out a lot longer, but the Plymouth has its place as well. And if we're looking at the British paper ships, the Duncan, the G3 in, but obviously not called G3 in the game, I really like that. It actually displays just how good the G3 actually was. I also like the Florida, which is essentially in the North Carolina with quadruple 14s instead of triple 16s, and the Georgia, which is a fast ship with three twin 16-inch guns. Three twin 18-inch guns. So it's a kind of Iowa period type vessel. I really like both of those. The Georgia is more verging over towards the hilariously fun to play element just because it's ridiculously fast and has a really nice secondary battery to it as well. Obviously, you've got things like Incomparable, which are just funny to play because it's so long. When it initially came out, it actually broke the camera system. You couldn't actually see the whole thing in certain camera views because it just went beyond the edges of the screen. And similarly, the Leon and I believe it's the Picardy is the like a premium version of it. I like those just because they're not the world's best ships in the game, but I do appreciate the absolutely insane number of main battery guns they have because those are the ones with 4 quad turrets. Then you've also got, sort of following down a similar vein, I suppose, at that point, some of the German aircraft carriers. Now, actually, I personally hate them as aircraft carriers, but a few of them, like the Graf Zeppelin particularly, are just really, really funny to build with a maximum strength secondary battery build. In random games, that's actually a really terrible idea. But if you occasionally do the 1v1 competitions and so forth, you can get a surprising amount of mileage out of secondary build German aircraft carriers for some reason. But I do also find them absolutely hilarious to play. Now, granted, there are a bunch of other paper World of Warships vessels that I do genuinely like to play here and there, but I think those are the only ones that immediately stand out to me as something I'd be like, oh yeah, I definitely want to play this today. Also, the Ahotnik class war canoe, while I'm thinking about it, that thing's also absolutely hilarious to play. It's got the durability of an eggshell, but it is really funny. David B asks, what if in the 20s and 30s the US had taken the pom-pom and adapted it for US use, but merged it with their own design ideas, so keeping the belt feed, but maybe making slightly larger ammunition closer to Bofor's size, propellant that the US already manufactured, changing the barrel length, etc. Would that have been feasible? And if so, what advantages would it have offered to the US Navy? And would this have been a good compromise? I mean, if you're changing the barrel length, the ammunition size, and therefore the breech, the propellant, etc., you're essentially inventing a US inspired by pom-pom gun. But nonetheless, I think the general idea certainly could have had a lot of benefits for the US Navy, although ironically, I think most of those benefits, you would have had almost a waveform of lots and lots of benefits compared to what they historically had at the start of the war. Then it would have dropped off a little bit, and then it would just come back up again with the kamikazes. So if you have a kind of a US pom-pom Mark II enhanced pom-pom, then initially, when you're looking at US ships in the interwar period being designed with relatively few but theoretically heavy medium caliber anti-aircraft installations, well, a quad or octuple US pom-pom is going to be infinitely better than the quad 1.1 inch for all sorts of reasons. And if you've already got it into production, then, well, you can start mass producing it and installing it on lots of ships. The reason why I say in sort of the mid-war period, at least as far as the US is concerned, perhaps utility would have dipped compared to what the Bofors offered in historical terms, is that the one limitation of the pom-pom, at least in this adapted form, would be because of the belt feed and so forth. It's probably somewhat heavier than the Bofors installation, so you wouldn't be able to have quite as many of them. And there are, fewer barrels, theoretically worse, although the flip side of you've got a long belt of ammunition so you can keep firing, potentially that might offset it. You won't have to store quite as much individual clips of ammunition floating around, although again, crew size to handle loading big belts and such is a bit of a weight issue. So you would have had more effective AA to start with, then potentially mildly less effective AA, but then once the kamikazes come in, it goes up to very, very much more effective again, because you'd still have a fair number, and I suspect cutting the weight would be part of the US design revisions. And once you get RPC and so forth towards the end of the war, the weight becomes somewhat less of an issue, although it's still a minor factor. But the ability to then just open up fully on kamikazes, hold down button, watch kamikaze disintegrate, without having to have people slamming 4-round clips in over and over and over again, that would definitely be very useful in the late war. The main thing the Bofors would offer against this US adapted version of the pom-pom would be the fact that in theory you could fit a lot more Bofors onto a big ship, potentially by the time you revised it, perhaps just more rather than a lot more. And of course, on much smaller vessels, submarines, destroyer escorts, and so forth, there you might actually be able to fit single and twin Bofors, where simply because of weight issues you couldn't fit a quad or octuple US pom-pom unit, and thus at that end of the scale it might be a choice between having medium anti-aircraft guns and not. Smalikaka asks, for notable navies, how far back in time would you have to send a Fletcher class before it could reasonably be expected to defeat the biggest and baddest ships in those other navies? Offhand, I'd say you're probably looking at somewhere around the mid 1900s, so kind of the 1904 to 1906, 1907 period, because obviously biggest and baddest, so you're talking essentially about battleships. After that period, not only have you got Dreadnought battleships in service, but you also have an increasing availability of rangefinders, centralized fire control systems, and gun elevations that allow those ships to engage at reasonably significant ranges. And yes, hitting a maneuvering high-speed Fletcher with 12 or 13.5 inch or 11 inch or whatever gunfire in the mid to late 1910s is not going to be easy, but it could happen. Hits could occur, and a Fletcher that's trying to maneuver in close enough for a torpedo solution, which is really what you'd need to take out one of those capital ships, really can't afford to be hit by so much as one or two battleship shells, because at this point in time they're very definitely going to be firing HE or CPC. We're not going to do a Yamato let's fire an AP round at the thing event. But the minute you drop below that time period, so you're now talking the late pre-Dreadnought period and then further back, while you do have some range finders and the occasional fire control system in some of the later pre-Dreadnoughts, you are looking at a much smaller main battery. The secondary batteries still don't have fire control systems and so forth, and so their accuracy is going to be quite reduced. And even for the main battery, the effective range, and as you drop back in time rather quickly, the absolute range starts to drop quite a lot until you get by the time you get to the late 1890s, you're talking about effective gun ranges that are, well, just look at the Spanish-American War, near enough Nelsonian at some points. And in that kind of environment, a Fletcher class could easily beat a kind of mid to mid-late period pre-Dreadnought, simply because it can sail quite happily outside of their gun range. And while, yeah, the 5-inch 38 battery could almost certainly mess up a pre-Dreadnought, that's potentially rendering it combat ineffective, not so much actually killing it, but it can unleash its torpedo volley from, relatively speaking, very close range for the Fletcher, but a range beyond which it can be safely or easily or perhaps at all engaged by the battleship's guns. And being a pre-Dreadnought, it's not particularly quick either. So at that point, you can just pick off capital ships with your torpedoes at varying ranges, all of which are pretty minimal. Wade Enyart asks, this question relates to my grandfather, who served on U.S.S. Block Island, mainly from spring 1945 through Magic Carpet. His daily duties were that he ran the ship's store. I don't know if he meant the one where you purchase things from, or stores as in ship supplies, but I do know after sailing through a large storm, all the beer bottles for the officers in the forward storage were broken, and he was in charge of cleaning it up. His other duty was he assisted in the post office, and his night watch was in one of the gun tubs on the port side midship, a little towards the stern. He'd point it out on a picture. My question is, would his night watch station also have been his general quarters station? And if not, is there any way to make an educated guess as to where his general quarters station might have been? The only sliver of information I got in this regard was that when he was at Okinawa, there was a kamikaze that got close enough to them, and as it was shot down and hit the sea, it flew over their fantail, and he could see the pilot silhouetted in the cockpit against the flames that were inside with him. By that statement, I would assume his general quarters station was topside somewhere, if he witnessed that, but I don't even know that for certain. So with regards to the first bit, I would say that from the description of having to clear up the beer bottles and also being assigned to the post office, I would say that when he's in charge of the stores, that actually means the ship stores, as in essentially the cargo, whether that be beer, food, etc., rather than a specific ship store where you can buy things from. That would be a slightly separate branch, I think, of the crew. Now, as far as his general quarters station, by doing a quick aggregate of various veterans accounts that I have access to, I notice a very high level of commonality of cooks, laundrymen, and storesmen and so forth, that kind of area of the ship. A lot of those crew had action stations on either the ship's anti-aircraft guns, the 20 mils and the 40 mils, or related to it in terms of passing ammo and so forth. There were a handful who had what you might call general action stations or general quarter stations, which would be essentially on damage control and firefighting parties. But by far the majority seem to have been in some way or shape or form associated with the ship's anti-aircraft guns when they were at general quarters. So given that his night watch station was in one of the gun tubs, and this is Block Island, by the way, if anyone's interested, then matching that together with where most people who were serving in his kind of area on the ship, on various US Navy ships, tended to end up, and combining that with the fact that he saw a kamikaze come down over the fantail and past him, I would bet with like a 95 to 98% certainty that his general quarters station was associated with the ship's anti-aircraft battery. And given that his night watch station would mean that he was fairly familiar with that specific gun tub, I would say there's probably an 80 to 85% chance that that was his specific general quarters station as well. But of course, if anybody has done more extensive research into that kind of very specific element of things, then feel free to comment in the comment section below. And to be clear, there is a certain logic to that kind of deployment of your crew, because it doesn't take a huge amount of separate training to show someone how to pass 40 mil or 20 mil ammunition, or even really how to operate a 20mm or 40mm gun in a pinch. And you've got to bear in mind, obviously, these escort carriers, they don't have a huge amount of armor, so keeping people below decks isn't really going to keep them safe if the ship gets hit. But having them up on deck means more hands passing ammunition and operating the guns. That means the ship is more likely to be safe because all their guns can be kept in operation. And if there are casualties amongst the gun crews, as there might be if the enemy strafes or there's some near misses and so forth, then there's plenty of warm bodies on hand to take over and maintain the rate of fire. So there is actually a good bit of sound logic in putting your storesman and so forth onto these additional duties when your ship is at general quarters in a ship that's as relatively unprotected as an escort carrier. John McCarthy asks, interpretations of the past seem to change with every new generation of historians, in part due to new information, more research, and reactions to earlier interpretations. Since World War II, it seems like we've seen several distinct narratives that each have been popular for a while, but were then replaced with a new story. In 5 minutes, I'm sure it's impossible to summarise how the narrative of World War II naval history has changed in the last 80 years, but could you give it a shot? Okay, well, I'll give it a very broad shot. Very early on, the narrative history was dominated to a certain extent by propaganda, because you were talking about the late 40s and 50s here, because a lot of that propaganda was still very deeply embedded, and in some cases was still the official story. Plus, you had the official Navy histories that were recorded very shortly thereafter, after the war. And of course, these relied on what was available in terms of wartime documents, reports, and interviews with various people, whether they be senior officers or lower ranks. Now, of course, that means a fair wealth of primary source information, but it's also subject to an awful lot of biases because the defeated side generally didn't have a huge amount of their literature published. So you might have an official document that says, well, on such and such a day, we think we shot down X number of aircraft. Well, that's great and fantastic. But if you don't have access to the German, the Italian, the Japanese, etc., archives to determine, well, how many aircraft did they not get back at the end of the day, it's very difficult to estimate exactly reasonably how many aircraft were actually shot down versus how many were damaged, how many just dove away, etc., and so on. So you could say this was a very one-sided era through a combination of the propaganda effect still kicking in, a certain amount of information from enemy archives or formerly enemy archives not being available, and also a lot of things still being classified. And to a certain extent, although I know this is sounding negative, but this is essentially pointing out the things that were missing, so therefore it is going to sound negative. Also, because a lot of the senior officers were still around, there would be some elements, even within primary documentation, that would either be made available or interviews and so forth, which might be trying to shield the reputation of certain officers who perhaps hadn't necessarily conducted themselves as well as the public image would want people to think. Then as you go through the 60s and the 70s, you start to get, particularly by the early to mid 70s, you start to get information coming out in reasonably large chunks from the former Axis countries, so that rebalances things. Certain information starts to be declassified as well, and there's still a reasonable number of people around who were involved in the war, but some of the more divisive figures perhaps aren't, so people are feeling a little bit safer to talk about, well, this captain or admiral wasn't necessarily entirely down with the way he that commanded things, and so on and so forth. Then as you get into the 80s and the 90s, you start to see a fair bit of revisionism coming along. Now, in part, that's because you have even more documents coming out, because most countries follow a staged series of classification, 30, 50, 90 years, for example, in the UK at that period. And so even more stuff that's sensitive is coming out, which is revising views still again. Even more documentation is coming out of formerly Axis countries, particularly in the 90s. You're starting to see documentation coming out that wasn't available prior to that with the end of the Cold War. documents that might have been held in East Germany and some even that were held in the Soviet Union are now being made available. You're also seeing the beginnings of the computer age, which is allowing both the creation and transmission of digital documents, which enables the transfer of information a lot more. So rather than, prior to that, you'd have photographs and handwritten notes, which can only be produced at a certain speed. And once you've got your handwritten notes, you don't necessarily want to give them to anyone else on a particularly long-term basis. But once you have early computers, this kind of stuff can be shared around a lot more. Therefore, there's a lot more information available in general, and therefore more people with more perspectives and different levels of expertise can look at things and perhaps start interpreting things and putting things together from where, this historian has spent their lifetime researching this and they found this, but this other historian has been researching an adjacent or overlapping field and they found this other thing which the first one missed, and the first one has stuff that the other person missed, and together that gives us a better picture, although again still subject to a fair bit of interpretation. And then as you move into the late 90s, early 2000s, there's most of the remaining classified stuff is being declassified. So this is where you're also learning about things like Bletchley Park. So, during most of the Cold War, the narrative about how the Allies knew where certain things were, a lot of it was down to either just nebulous, don't ask too many awkward questions, or things like spies and so forth, or lucky periscope sightings and aircraft sightings. Whereas once you understand just how extensive Allied code-breaking efforts were and how successful they were, suddenly it puts a whole new spin on things, both in terms of where that information came from in the first place and also interpretations on how it was used and why. And then, of course, now you're well into the 21st century, an awful lot more information is available digitally, which, again, allows for an awful lot more comparison, even though there is still a huge amount of work to be done with physical archival documents as well. But to a certain extent, once it's been done once and is available online, it cuts out an awful lot of unnecessary repetition, which is quite handy. You also, I think, begin to see more emphasis on, at least in some elements of history, the personal experience within the narrative history of World War II. Personal, social, I don't know exactly what you'd call it, as opposed to the bare bones technical and tactical side of things. And as translation, again, with the help of digital technology, has become easier and easier, you've also started to see a whole new slew of information that has been available in its local language for quite a while, but is now also made available, well, for this audience in English mostly, but also English books being translated into French, Japanese, German, Italian, etc., which has broadened the scope still more. I mean, with the best will in the world, outside of a core of hardcore researchers, how much information really did we have about the technical ins and outs of Italian battleships in English for the general public until Baniasco's book started to be translated? There was some, but it wasn't a huge amount compared to what we have now. Red Ranger asks, this may be outside the time period the channel covers, but as the saga of the Costa Concordia is once again making the rounds in the YouTube algorithm, given what we know about the damage it received, and with the benefit of hindsight, was there anything the crew could have done to, if not save the ship, at least control its foundering in such a way that refloating and repairing it would have been a viable prospect? Also, would a military ship from the World War I or World War II period, specifically a cruiser or capital ship, fare better with receiving a similar type of damage? And if so, what would be the main reason? So, to address the first part, could the Costa Concordia have been controlled in such a way that it could have been refloated and repaired? Yes, it could, although it would have actually required a competent captain, which is something Costa Concordia quite evidently lacked. But it still would have been difficult, because the gash that was torn in the side of Costa Concordia flooded basically all of its engine rooms, its machinery spaces, and the emergency generator, for whatever reason, didn't kick in. So it was without power, or without most power, at which point it was subject to its own inertia, which would have been quite considerable, and whatever the rudder was at. Now, if you had a situation where you have a gash big enough that it's taken out your entire machinery space and your emergency generators aren't kicking in. Me, especially considering that you're so close to the coastline, I would have immediately put the rudder hard over and gone, right, we're heading for the shore, ideally a beach. But, we're heading for shore. We're going to try and ground ourselves intentionally, because while we've still got our momentum, if we can hit shallow, whether it be a sandy shallow or a pebbly shallow, basically as long as we don't hit another big rock, then the ship will go aground. It'll be stuck fast, sure, but it'll be upright, it'll be easy to evacuate, and relatively speaking, easy to salvage because it won't settle all that much. Whereas what Costa Concordia appears to have done is just wander off gently into the distance until it had pretty much lost all momentum and then got blown back to where it was. So, yeah. Now, would a World War I, World War II military ship do better with similar damage? Yes, absolutely. Now, part of that would be generally more competent captain and people doing actual damage control, but also battle damage was an anticipated thing for those ships. So if you look at where the damage occurred on the Costa Concordia, because cruisers and battleships tend to have much more extensive machinery spaces in terms of overall volume of the ship and length of the ship, plus of course big guns, the kind of gash that you get on the Costa Concordia would correspondingly on your average cruiser or capital ship encompass the aft magazine spaces and also some of the aft machinery space. But firstly, it's very likely that a cruiser or battleship with damage in that same area, even if it flooded along that same line, would still have a good chunk of its machinery still operational, so it would be able to maneuver under power. And secondly, it's less likely that the flooding would have been as extensive because, of course, the machinery rooms are generally subdivided, the magazines are very subdivided, and so the flooding probably would have been less extensive in the first place, bulkhead doors and such like being shut. And on top of that, there's also a reasonable chance that a lot of the ship probably wouldn't have flooded much at all. In the World War I ships, because there would have been coal bunkers there, so you might have had even because the damage was low enough down, it would have bypassed the armor belt. But if it's opens up the coal bunkers, well, the coal bunkers will flood, and you might get some flooding through them, but it will be minimized, and then you've got the ship subdivision beyond that. And for World War II ships, the damage would have ripped open a bunch of the torpedo defense system void and liquid spaces, which, yes, would have caused a list, but not one that was irrevocable. I mean, that's what those torpedo defense systems are supposed to do. And even on a World War I ship refitted, there would have been bulges, most likely. And you could counter flood to maintain an even keel and so on and so forth. So, yeah, it would have been annoying, but for a World War I or World War II period ship, it wouldn't have been anything like as bad as it was for the Costa Concordia. Primark359 asks, in Mustard's most recent video on US carrier airships, while extremely well produced, he makes the perhaps sensational claim, the Navy's exercises seem almost guaranteed to ensure the Macon failed. Time and again the airship was forced to tactically scout crowded areas full of enemy ships and planes, but the Macon was built to search vast swathes of open ocean. Is this a fair characterization of how the airship was used in fleet problems, and how well does the rest of the video hold up to your scrutiny? Hey, that means I get to use this picture of Macon again. Now I'm going to look at this in two segments. Firstly, what do I make of the rest of the video, and then what do I make of that specific claim. Now, the rest of the video, I would say, generally speaking, is actually pretty good. There are a few issues that I would disagree with, but most of them are very slight and don't really affect the overall drift of the video. So I'll just go through those. Firstly, in terms of points I had issue with, talks about the Japanese expanding, yep, fine, but then talks about how the Japanese could potentially attack Hawaii, the West Coast, or the Panama Canal. Now, that technically was included in US fleet problems, especially attacks on the Panama Canal, if you've watched the Fleet Problems video series. However, one thing that was never quite taken into account in those fleet problems was the fuel issue. The Japanese fleet was never going to launch any kind of large scale assault on the US West Coast because it simply didn't have the fuel to get there and stay there to do anything meaningful. A raiding force potentially could have hit the Panama Canal, but still they're not going to be able to deploy an entire battle fleet there. I mean, you look at the amount of logistics that went in just getting the Kido Butai to Hawaii, which is a lot closer. So it's a very small nitpick, but I would have said it was feared that the Japanese could attack. Maybe something like the Japanese could attack Hawaii. We know they could do that, and it was feared that they might attack the West Coast or the Panama Canal. Whereas the way it's worded, it sounds like they objectively could, which isn't really the case. Then, when mentioning the Omaha class, they're described as slow cruisers. That's the one I'd probably take the biggest issue with, because the Omahas were not slow. In fact, they were some of the fastest cruisers in service at the time. They might be slow relative to aircraft, but given that the basic cruising speed was given, not the scout cruising speed, and they're described as slow, that's not necessarily the case. I think I would have worded it as, although fast for ships, they were still much slower than aircraft, and that would have been a lot more accurate. Also, although they make one very brief mention of an officer serving on all of the US Navy's previous airships, they kind of jump straight to Akron and Macon. They don't actually make any specific mention of Shenandoah and Los Angeles, which I think they should merit at least 30 seconds because they are the stepping stone. It's not like the US went from no airships to Akron and Macon. But that could be an editorial oversight. Then, in terms of when Akron goes into the storm and say, well, they didn't know how tough these things could be. Okay, yeah, they might not have known exactly how tough the Akron class design was, but there was a fair bit of evidence on how tough rigid airships were in storms from various foreign-built airships. Obviously, a lot of German Zeppelins, but also some of the British ones, and Shenandoah and Los Angeles. So, yeah, I think that's probably, it's not an inaccurate statement if you want to be very specific, as in I said, they didn't know exactly how strong Akron could be, but the implication that they didn't know how strong rigid airships could be, I think is perhaps a step too far, but not a major issue. Another really nitpicky thing in the wireframe models that they show when they're showing how Macon would scout, they have US fast battleships, probably Iowa's depicted, which technically speaking for the mid-1930s is not accurate. They should be using a standard, but they, again, very, very nitpicky. Then when they're talking about how Macon revised its recon plan from Macon itself scouting to using its fighters to scout for it, they mentioned that there wasn't any homing beacon at the time. Again, technically not true. There wasn't any homing beacon in service with the US Navy. The first prototype homing beacons for aircraft would be installed on the U.S.S. Saratoga in 1938, and to be fair, in 34, 35 is long before that. However, the idea of a homing beacon for aircraft at sea was already known. The service trials for the Type 72 homing beacon in the UK actually took place in 1933, so before Macon's plans were revised, and they actually started testing the Type 72 in 1936. So while homing beacons for aircraft weren't in service yet, they were already known of and being experimented with overseas. So again, just a minor bit of rewording, I perhaps would have said, while the bit, something like, because the US Navy did not yet have a homing beacon in service, or a working homing beacon in service, would have been more accurate than to say they didn't exist yet. And then lastly, in terms of Akron and Macon, if they'd still been around or successors had been built, potentially spotting the Japanese fleet coming in that attacked Pearl Harbor, I mean, again, yes, very technically that is possible. If Akron or Macon or some successor had been around, it is physically possible, if they'd been on patrol, that they could have spotted the Kido. However, two things. One, as the fleet problem showed, airships were quite vulnerable to being shot down, and, well, yeah, you don't really want to bet on your chances against a bunch of zeros. So, and if it was known that those airships still existed, the Japanese would have had a combat air patrol up, so it's entirely possible that the airships could have been shot down before they got word out, or the fighters that spotted things could have been shot down, if it was the fighters that saw things. But also, it would require the airship in question to be in roughly the right area doing the search, and there's no particular reason for them to be doing that. So, yes, it could technically have happened, but saying if they'd still been around in 39, they would have, yeah, not so much. But as you can see, most of it is just slight changes to wording. About the only thing I'd really take issue with is the description of the Omaha class as slow, because they weren't. Now, going over to the claim that the Navy's exercises are almost guaranteed to ensure Macon failed because it's forced to tactically scout crowded areas, that bit I would say is actually flat out wrong. Yes, Akron and Macon were built to search vast swathes of open ocean. So were cruisers. So was anything with the scouting mission. The ocean is big and mostly open. That's why you need to scout it. Otherwise, you'd know where everything was. The point of the fleet problems was to see if the airships could actually do that job properly. And, well, inevitably, when you find the enemy fleet, that is going to be a crowded area full of enemy ships and planes. That is what you're there to find. That's what a cruiser or a destroyer or a battle cruiser, if the US Navy had any, were supposed to find. So by saying it was forced to scout what? The enemy fleet. That is what it was supposed to try and do, and it didn't work out very well. I mean, to be fair, it was very good at finding the enemy fleet when the weather allowed. That was a problem. Major headwinds sometimes prevented it from doing the air search, but it just wasn't very good at surviving that contact. It was a fairly big and obvious thing to spot, as opposed to an aircraft which could more easily hide in the clouds. And obviously it was slower than the aircraft, so enemy aircraft could and did do simulated shootdowns on it. And, using the Sparrowhawks to conduct the search was a pretty good idea to mitigate that. But it's not like these fleet exercises were, well, we're going to put the two fleets 50 miles away from each other, to the point that you could almost see them from the Macon while it's hovering over its own fleet, and we're going to force you to go straight to them. Now, these fleet problems, again, as you've seen the fleet problem videos, they started out quite a way apart from each other, and it often took them several days to find each other. And sometimes the referees actually had to step in and kind of point everybody in roughly the right direction, because they weren't going to find each other anyways. And some elements of fleet problems actually involved, where escape or evasion or bypassing was involved, did actually end up with a whole fleet problem going by with virtually nothing of the opposing fleet actually being seen. So, in terms of simulating the area that the airships would have to search, the fleet problems were actually pretty realistic in what they would face. If anything, they were a little bit generous, because at least you knew the enemy fleet was somewhere in this several tens of thousand square mile area, as opposed to somewhere in this ocean. And the airships were therefore able to, search a big swathe of ocean, and then eventually, hopefully, find the enemy fleet and then come a cropper. So, yeah, it wasn't that they were forced to do something they weren't designed to do. They were designed to do basically a three-stage thing. Search for the enemy fleet, find and report the enemy fleet, and then escape. And they were very, very good at searching, generally, again, apart from contrary headwinds, but then weather could also hamper scout aircraft. And with the deployment of the Sparrowhawks, that expanded their search radius, so very good at that. Reporting the enemy fleet, again, they were very good at that, admittedly. Even when they got shot down in the simulation, they did manage to report the location of the enemy fleet. It was just the survival bit they weren't very good at. And that's not because they were forced into a situation they, in real life, wouldn't have done. And I mean, if anything, those fleet problems were pretty generous when you compare to the scenario they suggest later on about Pearl Harbor, because the availability of aircraft carriers for those fleet problems meant at best you'd be facing 2 flight decks worth of aircraft, whereas if you want to scout the Cuba Battalion, that's 6 flight decks worth of aircraft. So yeah, that one section I would say isn't really accurate. It's trying to make it out as if the Macon was perhaps a bit more capable than it actually was, I would say. But broadly speaking, as a history of the airships and so forth, so it's a pretty decent video. That doesn't mean I'm not going to do my own at some point, because I will. Andre DeCoult asks, how was fire control redundancy accomplished? There were multiple rangefinders, but what about the fire control computer? Did ships have a backup for that? And how did they do it when they had to revert to local control and start using the turret's own rangefinder? Did they have pre-printed range tables? And how was Yamato supposed to engage 2 enemy battleships at the same time? Was it built explicitly with multiple fire control computers able to send different fire solutions to individual turrets? So when it came to the fire control computer, it depended. Some ships had multiple plotting rooms, usually 2, but it did vary. So some early ships would just have the one fire control computer in the single plotting room, if you're using American parlance. Sometimes ships would have 2, but one would be the primary plotting room, which would have the full spec fire control computer, and then a secondary plotting room would have a lesser device, perhaps an older device or a simpler, more compact device because of space limitations. And sometimes they'd be relatively close together, sometimes they'd be further apart. And then kind of the ultimate configuration you'd see on the later fast battleships, like if you go and visit an Iowa class, you'll find that there's a forward plot and an aft plot, and they both have the same full spec fire control computers. So in some ships, even if you somehow lost one of your plotting rooms, you could go over to using the other one. Although, I mean, it's good backup, don't get me wrong, but to be fair, if you've taken a hit that's so terrible that your plotting room, which is fairly deep in the ship and under the deck armor, has been wiped out, you probably have more things to worry about than the fact you've lost that plotting room. But there you go. And within those plotting rooms, which is again why I'm referencing the Iowas, because they're the most commonly visitable battleship, because, well, there's more of them than there are preserved fast battleships of every other class combined. But you'll see a pretty similar thing if you visit the plotting rooms of North Carolina, Massachusetts, or Alabama. And that is, when you're in them, or when you're looking at them perhaps from outside, depending on if they're screened off, you'll see that part of the control panel setup allows you to individually select inputs and outputs for specific gun turrets. So in theory, if an Iowa class was outnumbered, let's say a couple of Congos were trying to attack a aircraft carrier group, and one of the Iowas was the ship on that side of the formation, and they need to engage both at the same time, in the same way that Yamato was designed to engage multiple battleships, then what you would do is, let's say, for example, the forward plot room would go, okay, I'm going to select turrets 1 and 2, and now all data that's being received, calculated, and sent out by the forward plot room would only go to turrets 1 and 2. Meanwhile, in the aft plot room, they would select that their system is not going to send information to 1 and 2, but it is going to send it to 3, and obviously the forward room would not send it to 3. So then the aft plot can send information to turret 3, and turret 3 obviously would be using presumably the rangefinder that's set to the aft section of the Iowa, at which point you can essentially treat it as 2 entirely separate systems. Now, assuming for whatever reason that you've lost communication to any and all plotting rooms you might have, or perhaps the main rangefinders, both fore and aft and in multiple, which I've got a picture of the Littorios here, because you can see there are multiple sets of rangefinders up there. Somehow all of that has been lost. Like, well, let's say your Bismarck. That's a good example. And you have to revert to local control for whatever reason. Again, it varies depending on the ship and time period, but if we're talking about the more advanced ships, obviously they will have rangefinders in each turret, but again, citing the Iowas, but also if you look at other US fast battleships, they'll have their own mini fire control computer in the turret. It's nowhere near as advanced or as capable as the one down in the main plot room, but it's a heck of a lot better than just going off a pre-printed table. Now, that's not necessarily the case in all ships, and sometimes, again, depending on time period, depending on refit status, depending on the ship, sometimes, especially with ships where you'd have 2 twin turrets forward, 2 twin turrets aft, one of the turrets would have the little fire control computer, and then it would be the master for that section. So if you've lost everything amidships, all your plotting rooms and main rangefinders, then while both turrets could use their rangefinders to sight things, one turret would do the calculation for both forward turrets, the other turret, one of the turrets aft, would do both the calculations for both aft turrets. And if you're in such a bad spot that not only have you lost communication with all your plot systems, rangefinders and midships, and potentially the other turret that was doing the calculations for you, then you would have some basic pre-printed tables. But to be perfectly honest, if you're down to the point where you're relying on your own rangefinder and some pre-printed range tables because everything else is offline, again, you probably have much bigger things to worry about. And also, again, very much dependent on the ship, but in some ships, the rangefinder systems for the secondary battery could function as rangefinders that provide information to the primary fire control battery. Now, of course, the rangefinders for the secondary battery, whether that be anti-surface or dual purpose or anti-air, there's nothing about the rangefinder itself that means it can't range, other than the fact it's usually going to be a smaller system and therefore slightly less accurate at long ranges, but it's more about the data links. Does that actually also feed to the primary plot, or does it just feed to the anti-air fire control system and then straight back to the anti-aircraft guns? In some ships, it will be a whole interconnected system. So in theory, you could lose your fore and aft main rangefinder and later on radars, but then you could then go, oh, okay, well, we're going to use the systems from the anti-aircraft battery. But, and this is a fairly important one, the rangefinders on the secondary battery, while in some cases they might be slightly higher than the ones on the turrets and therefore able to see slightly further, they are going to be smaller than the ones on the turrets. So you could use their data as input, but personally I would say use them as an input rather than the input, because if you're down to that level of redundancy, you should be using the biggest rangefinders you can get, which are going to be the ones on your turrets. Larry G asks, during World War I, was there much German and submarine activity off the US Florida coast, and how effective was the US aircraft-based anti-submarine effort? As far as I'm aware, there wasn't all that much German submarine activity off the US Florida coast. There were German submarines operating off the American coast from 1916 onwards, although they made a major campaign of it for obvious reasons in 1918. But if you look at a map of the ships sunk, it appears they operated off the North Carolina coast and further northwards rather than southwards. Now, that's not to necessarily say there wasn't any German submarine activity off the Florida coast, without looking into detail at the cruise log of every German submarine that went over to the western side of the Atlantic in World War I, but it does appear that there certainly wasn't any successful German anti-submarine activity off the Florida coast. And as far as the US's aircraft-based anti-submarine efforts, they had some effect, because, well, U-boats didn't like being bombed and they didn't have all that much in the way of reliable or any anti-aircraft armament, depending on the sub. But with the relatively primitive state of aircraft and what anti-submarine weapons they could carry, etc., they were more of a nuisance value and a driving the submarine off value rather than a strictly sinking the submarine value. Indeed, if I'm not entirely mistaken, the number of U-boats that could be confirmed destroyed by aircraft in the First World War could be counted by Admiral Yamamoto on one hand. But of course, as well as annoying and suppressing subs, aircraft could also call in the attack by more capable surface vessels, so there was definite benefit to it. Now, the Florida coast off World War II, yeah, that's a slightly different matter. Samuel G. Gurley asks, the practice of the captain going down with the ship has always seemed a bit self-defeating to me. How did it start? Did captains who decided not to go down with their ship afterwards suffer negative consequences? So the tradition seems to have started, loosely speaking, somewhere in the middle of the 19th century. Theoretically, I mean, it depends on which country you're looking at, because some countries actually have fairly strict laws. They don't necessarily compel the captain to be the last off of the ship or to go down with the ship, but they do usually tend towards compelling the captain to remaining on board for an extended period of time by force of law rather than force of tradition. But as a tradition, as I said, it seems to be mostly codified in the mid 19th century, with it being introduced earlier than that in as a tradition in various countries at different times. But it's as much a reflection of changing social expectations as much as maritime traditions, because if you go back far enough into kind of the middle of the age of sail and prior to that, then a captain going, you know what, I'm off when the ship is sinking, while not entirely common, it was more common than you might think. But once you get to the Victorian period, there is very much more of an expectation that the captain should be the last off of the ship, and that is kind of where it conflates, because the idea is that the captain is ultimately responsible for the safety of the ship, the operation of the ship, and the fate of the ship, and the safety of all passengers and crew. So, if a ship is sinking, then the captain's duty is not to leave the ship. The captain's duty is to do everything in his power to stop the ship sinking, and if that is not possible, then it is his duty to get everybody off the ship. And of course, if he's supposed to get everyone off the ship, he must therefore be the last person off of the ship. But if he's the last person off of the ship, it's very possible that the ship will be in a critical condition by the time he makes his own attempt to escape, which makes it much more likely that he may be either is still on board the ship when it goes down, seeing the last few people off, or he's fairly close to the ship and gets sucked down with the ship or dragged down with the ship if there's loose debris that might entangle him. So the chances of the captain being killed are significantly higher than for everybody else if he is following procedure and getting everybody else off before him. And then that, of course, conflates with, well, what happens if there are people aboard the ship and there is no chance of them getting off, either because there are insufficient boats or because they're trapped below decks or they're trapped by flooding or something like that? Well, there are still people on the ship. The captain is still responsible for them. Now, you could make a utilitarian argument and say, well, there's nothing he can do for them at that stage, therefore he should also escape. But from a sense of chivalry or honour or personal responsibility, captains sometimes would go, okay, well, my responsibility is for everyone. I should see everybody off. I have failed to see these people off. Therefore, I should share their fate because I've been unable to fulfill my responsibility to them and they're going to lose their life as a result. So, fair is fair. And down they go with the ship. And captains who did abandon the ship ahead of the ship sinking or with substantial numbers of people still on board very often would suffer negative consequences, either socially in the press or at a court martial. Because, of course, if you're the captain of a military vessel that sinks, you are going to be court martialed no matter what. Now, the court martial might be more of a formality if it's publicly and easily provable that you did everything in your power and there's nothing further you could have done to save the ship. But obviously, if the court finds that you left the ship too early or something like that, then it might actually be a problem for you. I mean, in some ways, you could draw a parallel to, the Horatius at the bridge kind of thing, the hero who stands in the gap to delay the enemy just a little longer so that everybody else can escape or get to safety or whatever in land-based warfare, or the Dahar master in Star Trek Deep Space Nine, who doubles back in his bird of prey to hold off the Jem'Hadar just long enough for the other Klingon birds of prey to get back to friendly lines. And those people are considered quite heroic. In some ways, the captain staying aboard a ship to the end, or until absolutely everybody else is reasonably safely off, is kind of the same thing, except in that case, rather than a human enemy, you're facing off against the sea, I guess. Paul from Chicago asks, did any Soviet ships suffer unexplained and or catastrophic malfunctions while in the general vicinity of Polish vessels during the Second World War, both before and after the Soviet Union switched sides? I'm not aware of any such fate for any Soviet ship, largely on the grounds that when the Polish Navy was in Poland, they were a little bit too busy fighting the rather more immediate presence of the Kriegsmarine and or getting the heck out of there to get over to the UK to continue the fight later on. And then once the Soviets entered the war on the Allied side, well, it seems, whether by happenstance or perhaps by design, the British kept the Poles away from the Soviets. But to be perfectly honest, the Poles were never going to be operating in the Black or Baltic Seas, which is where the majority of the Russian ships were. So there wasn't really much opportunity for them to operate in this vicinity of each other. About the only place you could plausibly have gotten them to run into each other would have been on the Arctic convoy runs. And while a fair number of free Norwegian vessels served on the Arctic convoy runs, there don't seem to have been that many, if any, Polish vessels serving on the Arctic convoy runs, which is what makes me think this was done rather deliberately, keeping them apart just in case. Jonathan Smith asks, having just seen the musical Operation Mincemeat, I'd love some more information about HMS Seraph's part of that deception. Can you tell us about her trip to Spain, how she was running on the surface versus submerged, or how much she was doing either, what perils or issues did she encounter, etc.? Well, there's not a huge amount to tell about her trip to Spain. She ran fairly standard procedure, i.e. run on the surface at speed at night, submerged during the day because she's travelling off of mostly enemy-held coastline, or once you get to the Spanish and Portuguese coast, ostensibly neutral coastline, but it's still liable to be attacked by patrolling aircraft from the Luftwaffe based in southern French airfields during the day. She was actually attacked a couple of times by German aircraft, but she got through that fairly unscathed, and then she showed up at the relevant place to drop off the body and did a bit of recon during the day, popped up, dropped the body off, and then headed further out to sea, which is where they got rid of the canister the body had been in. So, yeah, not a huge amount to say about the trip. It was relatively routine, apart from the bombings, but even they're not uncommon. But it is interesting to note that actually Seraph had a mediocre record as an actual combat submarine. She managed to damage a couple of ships and sink a few small ones, but her war patrols were not particularly brilliant. However, she did have quite a lot of form, and indeed this was one of the reasons, was the fact she was heading for the Mediterranean anyway, but one of the reasons she was selected for this mission is because she actually had specifically quite a bit of former Special Forces operational experience, and would actually go on to continue to conduct a number of Special Forces and covert style missions apart from her main war patrol. So she very much was a Special Forces submarine, if you wanted to call her that. And that, of course, meant she was fairly experienced at the whole sneaking close to an enemy coast and dropping things off aspect of the mission. And interestingly enough, towards the end of the war, she was actually quite heavily modified when the Royal Navy got wind of the German Type 21 and Type 23 U-boats. So she was streamlined as much as was possible in order to better understand how a high speed, or high underwater speed submarine rather, would be a threat to convoys as opposed to a regular speed submarine. What kind of new tactics and strategies might you see the Germans developing? Now, of course, even heavily modified and streamlined, she was never going to hit the same kind of top speeds as a Type 21 or Type 23, because that's just not what she was designed for, and she didn't have the motor power or the battery capacity for it. But it was a good intermediate step in as an interim measure to get some idea of how a submarine operating at above average speed would cause additional problems. Jack von Kuhn asks, why did the Spanish Empire, during the Age of Sail, use such a strange crew system? With the vastness of their empire and its near-total reliance on treasure fleets from their overseas possessions, it would seem this was a relatively poorly conceived system of crewing their warships. Why would such a far-flung empire build their navy on this convoluted and inefficient system? So this is referring to the kind of fixed service, if you like, almost like national service style system that the Spanish Navy operated at the height of the Age of Sail for crewing their ships for regular crew, as opposed to officers and a small number of volunteer regulars as well. Well, it's a very complicated answer actually, but I'll try to summarize it briefly. Some of the biggest driving factors come from the fact that as you begin to approach the Age of Sail, so you're talking the early to mid medieval period, you've got to remember that Spain, although it's nowhere near as new a country as Germany or Italy, is also nowhere near as old a country as France or at the time England, which had been, relatively speaking, unified countries, even if England did own a few chunks of France, for most of the second millennium. Spain, on the other hand, had gone through this whole period where, one, it was a set of divided kingdoms, Aragon, Castile, etc., etc., and two, it had been occupied in large part in the south by the Moors, and they had only really, towards the last stages of the medieval period, just about succeeded in reconquering everything, the Reconquista. And so you had a somewhat fractious nation that was made up of a bunch of competing kingdoms and recently reconquered territories, and relatively speaking, and that meant that central control was a little bit less strong, shall we say, as compared to somewhere where a centralized monarchy had been embedded for multiple centuries at that point. Even if there had been a series of rebellions and wars within said monarchy, there was at least the general concept that, you know, France or England, such as they were ruled by a single monarch. That was a somewhat newer concept in Spain. This couples with the predations of the Barbary pirates, who really went to town on the Spanish coastline, and that actually significantly depopulated the coastline. To a certain extent, you could even argue that the Spanish coastline hasn't even really recovered to this day, and certainly in the Age of Sail, it hadn't really recovered either. When you look at the overall population of Spain compared to how many people lived on its coast, and then compare that to the overall population of France and how many people lived on its coast, the overall population of England and how many people lived on its coast at the same time period, you'll see that, you know, the areas that hadn't been essentially ransacked multiple times by the Barbary pirates further north tended to have a higher proportion of people and larger individual settlements, and more of them, on their coastline as compared to Spain. So Spain actually had a relative, for its size, proportional lack of experienced sailors. And of course, with a lot of fairly lucrative trade going on, there was strong incentives to do that. And there's a certain minimum number of fishermen that you need, because fishing and other related activities help feed the country. And at that point, you know, service in a navy, where there was still a very heavy distinction between the aristocratic officer class and the non-aristocratic crewmen, that wasn't particularly attractive for most people. So trying to levy forces or set of sailors out of various places was occasionally tried, usually was fairly unpopular at best, and could actually significantly impact the operation of civilian ports and harbours at worst. And so, in the end, although there was a register of how many trained or experienced sailors there technically were in the kingdom, the number that could be called on at any one time outside of a national emergency was actually pretty small. And if you did so, if you started recruiting a fair number of them, you ran the risk, as I said, of crippling other industries that were equally as vital. And so the system of, well, okay, everybody near enough who we could technically count as somewhat qualified is going to have to serve in the Navy, but only for a little bit, was pretty much the only way they could thread that particular needle, i.e., levying enough consistent manpower to actually man the fleet, while not crippling the rest of their maritime economy at the same time. There are a lot more complex social and strategic reasons as well, but that's, I think, about the best summary I could do in a few minutes. Grummancat asks, about sand on the deck in the Age of Sail. I can understand the usefulness of soaking up blood, but didn't that pose a terrific risk of crewmen slipping and leading to injuries? And did most navies adopt this practice, or only the Spanish? Was blood soaking the decks really more serious than slipping on the sand, or did nobody simply slip at all? So, sanding the deck before battle was actually quite a common practice during the Age of Sail. And yes, if you put excessive amounts of sand on the deck, there is a risk of slipping. However, you've got to remember that the decks of wooden warships were very regularly holystoned, i.e. smooth. And I mean, apart from giving the crew something to do, it also helps remove things like algae and keeps the ships clean. And obviously, as anyone who's had a wooden deck in their back garden or backyard will know, if you leave it for a few months and it gets wet and algae grows, oh boy, there are few surfaces that have less friction than an algal strewn wooden deck. But what this does mean is that although the wooden deck has some friction, it is now essentially a very smooth wooden surface. And if you're walking around, grip is fine. If you're having to run around and potentially you've got a lot of friction, well, defrictioning elements, so it's not just blood, but you're going to be sweating, everyone else is going to be sweating, so there's possibly going to be a fair amount of sweat going on. You're going to have the gun ports open, so on the lower gun decks you might have the occasional wave come in. You're also, because there's going to be a lot of fire, as in, hopefully not fire as in your ship on fire, but fire as in the guns firing, there's going to be smoke, cinders, dirt, all sorts of things building up inside. And if you're running around a lot, it's going to be building up on your feet, and that could be essentially filling in the ridges on the skin of your feet, making your feet quite slippery. And then combine that with a smooth wooden deck, and suddenly you've got a recipe for all sorts of slip, trips, and falls. And so what sand is doing, as long as it's applied in a relatively thin layer, is that the weight of you and the weight of everybody else, the weight of the cannon, etc., is very quickly going to somewhat press a thin layer of sand actually into the wooden deck, and thus essentially create a somewhat high grip environment. Plus, it's also going to serve as a little bit of an abrasive, and it's going to be, therefore, your feet might not thank you the next day, but it's going to be essentially removing some of the built-up muck that might be building up on your feet, which will keep your feet actually in traction as well. And then, of course, you've got the fact that if you're having to really put your back into something like hauling a cannon out, or trying to change the rigging or whatever, again, you're putting a fair amount of force down through your feet into the deck, and at that point, again, the sand is going to get trapped and provide some grip rather than your feet just slipping on a smooth wooden deck. But of course, as you kind of indicate, you do have to be a bit careful about how much sand you put down, because you don't want to end up like a kid's playing area, because then you will start slipping around. Kra F1 asks, how beneficial was the transom stern design? The idea is to boost the top speed of a ship, but it creates a drag penalty at lower speeds. Was this worthwhile in practice? Are there cases of the opposite, where a transom stern was designed around more efficient cruising at the cost of top speed? So unless you're cruising at a relatively high speed, and we'll come back to that in a second, you can't really design a transom stern for cruising at the cost of top speed, because a transom stern works off of the physics of hydrodynamics. And in very crude terms, as a rule of thumb, a transom stern is better above 15 knots and worse below 15 knots. So if you're planning on your cruising speed being above 15 knots, then a transom stern is good in all regimens. Whereas if perhaps you're cruising at 10, 12 knots, but your top speed is above 15 knots, you'll have a bit of a play-off to decide on. there's a lot of complicated hydrodynamics going on to do with high pressure areas, low pressure areas, flow separation, vortices, and so forth. But the very, again, basic explanation is that because you have a very sharp cutoff with a transom stern, the water flow that goes along the side of the ship is essentially tricked into thinking that the rest of the stern, if you thought about a normal cruiser or battleship type stern, that it thinks the rest of the stern is there, and therefore your effective waterline length is actually longer than your ship actually is, which sounds a little bit counterintuitive, but go with it. And because the effective waterline length is what determines your hull speed, and that in turn dictates how much power you will need to use at any given speed below that hull speed, and therefore your efficiency, a transom stern helps. But below 15 knots, the disturbances, the vortexes it creates, manage to interact with the ship in a negative fashion because essentially you can't outrun them quickly enough. So for a warship that is planning on doing a lot of high-speed maneuvering, like a cruiser or a fast battleship, it's definitely worth it. If you're something like, say, a escort vessel that perhaps can't really do much more above 15 knots, maybe your top speed's in the 18 to 22 knot range, and you're going to spend a fair amount of that below 15 knots hunting submarines, a transom stern may not be for you. But there is another advantage to a transom stern, which is nothing to do with the hydrodynamics of it. It's simply that, as you can see here with Vanguard stern, it means the aft end of your ship is considerably wider and therefore has more volume than a traditional stern, which means you can put more things in it if you want to. And in more recent times, post when the channel covers, that also means you've got quite a useful wide aft area where you can land things like helicopters. But the other thing I think you have to bear in mind when it comes to efficiency, especially when you're talking about warships that might hit the high 20s or low 30s of knots, is that yes, below 15 knots you're going to be less efficient than a ship with a traditional stern, but how much is that going to affect your fuel consumption? Because remember, at high speeds you consume a huge amount of fuel, at low speeds you tend to consume much less fuel. So using arbitrary figures, let's say if your ship with a conventional stern at 10 knots consumes, let's say, a ton of fuel for an arbitrary amount of time. Well, if you're in the same ship traveling at 30 knots, you might consume 10 tons of fuel in that same arbitrary amount of time. Now, let's say that your transom stern offers you a 10% efficiency saving at high speeds, but perhaps offers a 10% inefficiency at low speeds. Again, this is purely arbitrary. You know, these figures don't have any particular relation to actual real world figures other than the general drift, because obviously exact fuel consumption figures at different speeds are going to be different for different ships. And then obviously if you have the same ship with a transom stern, it's all going to be different, but this is just to get the general idea across. So if you're traveling at 10 knots and you're consuming 1 ton of fuel for a given unit of time, and your transom stern is making you 10% less efficient, well, that means you're going to consume 1.1 tons of fuel for that given amount of time, which means you'd need to sail for 10 units of time, and then you would have consumed 1 ton more fuel than you would have otherwise. Whereas if you're sailing at high speed, in 1 unit of time, you would only use 9 tons of fuel, because that's 10% off of 10. So in 1 unit of time of high-speed sailing, you save as much fuel as you would lose in 10 units of time of low-speed sailing. And again, that's assuming that the efficiency and inefficiency is equal. That's not actually going to be the case. And it's assuming that you're sailing at low speed for quite a long time, Whereas, as I said, if your cruising speed is at or around 15 knots, it's probably not going to make a huge amount of difference to your efficiency at low speed, but you still get the high speed savings. And the other thing to bear in mind is that if you're looking at your high speed sailing, it's not just about fuel savings, it's you're saving fuel because you're using less power, which means that if you have a target top speed, let's say 30 knots, then either you can achieve that target top speed with less machinery than you would otherwise need, therefore saving weight and space, or if you keep the same machinery plant as you would need for hitting 30 knots in a conventional ship, you will actually maybe hit 31, 31 and a half, maybe even 32 knots. And you can actually see this almost directly when you compare three fast battleships of the 1940s, Vanguard, Bismarck, and Littorio. So Littorio is the lightest of the three and has an official maximum speed of about 30 knots, which she accomplishes it with just over 128,000 shaft horsepower, but with a standard displacement that's about 40 to 41,000 tons. Vanguard's official standard displacement is close to 45,000 tons, so let's say around 4 to 4,500 tons more than a Littorio, but she gets to 30 knots with almost an identical power plant, 130,000 shaft horsepower. So the transom stern, among other things, admittedly, but the transom stern is definitely helping there. You're getting 4,500 tons more ship going at the same speed for essentially the same power output. And then you look at Bismarck and Tirpitz, and so they're a little bit closer to Vanguard, 42,000 and 43,000 tons approximately standard displacement for the two of them. And Bismarck and Tirpitz obviously both capable of hitting around 30 knots as well, but Bismarck needs almost 150,000 shaft horsepower and Tirpitz almost 161,000 shaft horsepower to hit that 30 knot speed, despite weighing or displacing less than Vanguard. So Vanguard, in that case, although her weight margin over those two is slightly less, about 2,500 tons and about 1,500 tons respectively, she's still hitting the same speed despite that additional weight, roughly speaking a destroyer's worth of weight depending on which destroyer you use, but she's hitting the same speed as them with almost 20,000 shaft horsepower less than Bismarck and over 30,000 shaft horsepower less than Tirpitz. Scott Jennings asks, at the retirement party for one of my co-workers, I learned that in his earlier years he served in the U.S. Navy. When I asked him what position he held, he informed me that he was a ship fitter, third class. Could you please spend a few minutes discussing the role that ship fitters play in the Navy and where they could be found? So, more broadly, the role of a ship fitter, it's kind of in the name. By the World War II, Cold War period, it essentially means someone who works with, in the broader context, steel and tanks and welding and so forth. Basically, someone who puts together the big metal bits and some of the larger machinery and then tests them all. So somebody in a commercial dockyard, for example, who is welding all of the, I mean, there might also be a welder, but someone who is welding the hull plates into place and or then checking the welds or installing the pressure and ballast tanks in a submarine would be a ship fitter. And the US Navy obviously will have some of those themselves for certain sensitive work in fitting out the ships in dock. However, you will also find them aboard various vessels. Like in this photo, this is a World War II photo of the ship fitters aboard one of the US ships in that conflict. And as you can see, there's quite a few of them. And that's because in the naval specific term, a ship fitter also has a huge amount of expertise in the maintenance and repair of machinery as well as just basic metal. And so essentially you could see them as a rather specialized subset of the engineering crew who are in charge of keeping the complex machinery working, and when the complex machinery stops working, they also know how to make it work again. So, for example, while the engine room crew might very well know and have the expertise on how to fix their boilers, a ship fitter might find themselves one day working on the anchor capstan, the next day they might find themselves working on the aircraft launch catapult, the next day they might find themselves working on the turntable of a 5-inch 38 mount that's frozen up, the next day the Japanese aircraft might put a few 20mm holes in the superstructure, so they might be welding some patches in, etc., etc., etc. Ash the Lego guy asks, at least one 1870s British ironclad had anti-roll tanks installed. What other military ships in the time period the channel covers have anti-roll measures installed? What technologies were used? And were the sacrifices of space and weight justified by improved stability in rougher seas and during harder manoeuvres? Did technology to stabilize the guns directly end up dead-ending the fight to stop the whole ship rolling, or was it still a desirable attribute for a ship? There were a variety of anti-roll measures conceived in the late 19th century, some more successful than others. This is the SS Bessemer. This can firmly be put in the not particularly successful category, as good an idea as it might have seemed at the time. So, in terms of technologies used in the late 19th, early 20th centuries for anti-roll, nowadays we have deployable fin stabilizers, but back then, broadly speaking, the three most common anti-roll measures were anti-roll tanks, as you mentioned. Then you would have anti-roll gyroscopes, which are a little bit later than anti-roll tanks, but were installed in quite a number of ships. And part of the problem is sometimes they're described as anti-roll devices, sometimes they're described as stabilizers, pretty much doing the same thing. And the final thing, which is actually the least impactful in terms of complexity, is the bilge keel, which also dampens out rolling. So you might have a combination of those as well, because the bilge keel is obviously fairly simple to install on the outside of a ship, and therefore you might find a ship that has bilge keels and anti-roll tanks or gyros, but you'd be fairly hard pressed to find a ship that had both anti-roll tanks and anti-roll gyros, because there's potential of interference there. Were the sacrifices of space and weight justified by improved stability? Yes, generally speaking, although the installation of anti-roll devices wasn't necessarily universal, because ideally you should be designing a ship that's not, prone to rolling particularly terribly. But the potential consequences of a ship that did roll heavily, HMS Captain, for example, that certainly meant that if you did have a problem or you foresaw a problem, then installing some kind of anti-roll measure was very definitely the better thing to do. And in terms of the technology to stabilize guns being a dead end for the anti-roll device, not really, because although the gun stabilization systems are of course very useful, the fact is that if you can reduce the roll of the ship, and it's not just about reducing the roll completely, it's also about influencing how the ship rolls. Generally, for a gunnery platform, you want a slow, steady roll, and in that circumstance, a larger but slower and steadier roll is actually preferable to a very minimal roll, but one that is very, very short and sharp. And it's also good for seakeeping and all sorts of other things generally. But the other thing you've got to remember is that the gun stabilization on main battery guns is for the vertical. Now, that means, of course, that if you are firing broadside on, so completely perpendicular, guns are 90 degrees to your keel, then in theory, your gun stabilization system should be able to fully compensate or near fully compensate for the ship's roll. But of course, if you mitigate the roll, then the gun stabilizer doesn't have to do as much work, and potentially a ship that rolls very badly, you might actually travel beyond the ability of the gun to compensate. Especially, for example, let's say you're fighting at extremely long range, and your guns can elevate to 30 degrees, you elevate your guns to 28 degrees, because that's what your rangefinder says you need to do. But if your ship is rolling by 5 degrees, then your gun stabilizers can't physically make your guns elevate past 30 degrees, so they're going to hit the vertical stops, every time the ship rolls. Whereas if you can use an anti-roll measure and mitigate your ship's roll to 2 degrees in those sea conditions, then your gun compensation and stabilization systems can work. The other thing, of course, is that that's for the perpendicular condition. The minute you move off perpendicular, you can still compensate for the vertical to a degree, but if the ship, well, let's take the opposite. So you're firing dead ahead. Well, now your gun stabilizing system is compensating for the pitch of the ship, but it's not doing anything for the roll because the roll is operating at 90 degrees to it. And if you're firing at 45 degrees off of straight ahead, then your gun stabilizing system is partially compensating for pitch and partially compensating for roll, but it can't compensate for the entirety of both, at which point, again, mitigating your roll goes a long way towards helping stabilize your overall gunnery. Camino John asks, can you tell us more about La Marie 12? I know she's a late 1600 ship, but I'm keen to know more. How would you classify her? Was her aft structure common in ships of her class, or is she a one-off? Was the layout to her access to her powder magazine another innovation, or bad design choice, etc., etc.? So, spoiler alert, the whole question's a bit tongue-in-cheek, because La Marie 12 is, in fact, this ship from the Bugs Bunny cartoon Buccaneer Bunny. Now, as tongue-in-cheek as the question is, and as variable as the side of the hull actually is when there's a whole sequence going through the various gun ports, you can actually infer a surprising amount from the relatively simple drawing. As you said, yeah, it's definitely a late 1600 ship. That's primarily because, as you can see, she actually has 2 aft partial decks as well as a fairly substantial forecastle, but although she's got a reasonably substantial bowsprit, you can just see off there to the right, she's not got the rather extensive, finely pointed bow that you would see in perhaps a late Tudor or early Stuart period ship. Another thing to say, and obviously at least in this depiction, she has 6 gun ports per side, so a total of 12. Although we do see during the chase sequence, she definitely does have some cannons stored in the forecastle and stern castle as well, which means she has bow and stern chasers. But given the relative tubby nature of the ship, combined with the fact she's a 3-master, having just a half dozen guns per broadside means she's very definitely not a warship, and that big walking stern gallery aft as well means that this is almost certainly a merchant vessel, and at that point having a 12-gun armament is fairly substantial, so that probably makes her an Indiaman of some kind. Given that this is the design period, this makes her possibly actually a Dutch East Indiaman more so than a British East Indiaman, as there would be more large Dutch East Indiamen around at this point than British ones. But she could also just be a generic large trade vessel, obviously taken into pirate service. Of course, as you can see here, she is riding quite high, presumably using some kind of white lead-based paint as an early form of anti-fouling paint, because you can see her plimsoll line, which again fits the categorization because the pirate in question, whatever Yosemite Sam is playing in this particular iteration, he is burying his loot ashore, so presumably the ship is very lightly loaded, lightly stored, therefore riding quite high in the water. But no, you wouldn't typically have access to the ship's magazine signposted from right up on deck, although interestingly enough, again, they do have the covered access ways as well as hatchways, which is a remarkable bit of historical accuracy, especially for a age of sail merchant vessel. The other thing that's quite interesting is that in the more detailed sequence, when they're actually running along the side of the ship and firing cannons at each other, or more accurately, Bugs is firing cannons, the other guy's taking the hits, you actually see the gun ports mounted much higher than they are in this overall sketch, which again makes sense for a merchant vessel because lower down would be cargo, and just the upper enclosed deck would be where your guns were for defense, which also would mean they'd be fairly light guns. They're probably 6, 9 or 12 pounders. Rob Smith asks, about 6 years ago you did a short video about the UGG boat. My question is, how many technological steps are there between that magnificently functional log and an Iowa-class battleship? And what are those steps, and how long was each step to the top of the tree? Okay, well, very roughly speaking, if you're starting off with a hollowed out log, the early stages in terms of time are going to be a little bit fuzzy, but so I'm not really going to try and enunciate those until we get into something a bit more definitive. But essentially, you're going from here is a floating object to then a raft, which is multiple floating objects put together. Then you would go from a raft to something a little bit more hydrodynamic, i.e., bundle the floating things together in a way that means that we can control our direction a little bit better. And of course, there will be little side branches of this, like coracles and so forth, but we're trying to follow the main line of development for something that you could vaguely call a warship. And you don't just have to use wood, because things like bundled papyrus or reed boats like you see in ancient Egypt would fall under this category. They're kind of shaped roughly in a boat-like configuration, but initially they are just large bundles of material that you sit on top of. Then as things start to get larger and larger, you end up with a technological phase where you start to invent a structure to a ship. Now, for a very long time, that structure is not so much the main structural element of the vessel, it is a bracing, and the main structure of your ship is actually your hull. So by the time of, let's say, the Greeks and the Romans, they're using a variety of ship construction methods, but mortise and tenon is quite common. So essentially using wooden dowels or pegs to hold together hull planking and the ribs of the ship, etc., and the keel are more to keep that whole formation roughly in place rather than being the main structural element of the vessel. Again, there are a few side quests in ship design at that stage, but then as you move on to a time period where we can be a bit more definitive about time periods, you still have clinker built. Move on to clinker built ships in as the medieval period comes along. Although, from an efficiency perspective, whether you could say move on from or adopt is neither here nor there, because there's a whole argument between mortise and tenon built ships versus clinker built ships. But anyway, you have clinker built ships, that famous one being, for example, Viking longships. And that general form of construction of overlapping planks, again still held together by a wooden frame, will last for about 350 to 400 years in Northern Europe, depending on where exactly you happen to be. But then you will start to see carvel construction, which is where you have planks abutting each other rather than overlapping each other, and now the ship's framing, the ribs, the keel, etc., now becomes the structural element, and the planking is the bit that holds the water out. And before anyone points out, yes, I'm aware that in the Mediterranean and areas south and east of that, they did move over to carvel construction from mortise and tenon almost directly and much sooner. But given that the path asked for is to an armor-class battleship, I'm going via the Northern European tech path, because that is ultimately the direct line to the Iowas. So by, let's say, around the 15th century, you've fully moved over to carvel construction, frame-first construction, and ships being strengthened to carry guns as time progresses. And that's where you get, galleons, race-built galleons, etc. And as the number of guns increases, there's a shift in ship design towards becoming longer towards the end of the Tudor period, beginning of the Stuart period. So that'd be the late 1500s and early 1600s. And that brings about the sort of embryonic form of the ship of the line as you would think of for the entire age of sail. A, relatively speaking for its time, long vessel with broadside batteries. And although there are lots of small technological improvements, broadly speaking, that overall design style and construction method remains in place for several hundred years, just getting bigger and more refined until the end of the 18th, beginning of the 19th centuries, when you get the various reforms by Seppings and Simmons, which kind of kickstart a revolution in ship design. Other people have made some similar advances previously, but these are the ones that kind of really kick in and spread. So rounded sterns, cross bracing, and so forth, beginning of the inclusion of iron in some strapping and so forth, although that has started to pick up in the mid to late 18th century already. That much stronger, much larger wooden ship construction moves you forward to the 1830s, 1840s. You start to see steam propulsion come in. Then in the 1840s, you start to see iron hulls and iron hull framing and hull plating come in, at least in commercial vessels. Of course, we know there's the whole full storm of iron for warships. Then, as you move into the 1860s, you get full iron framed, iron hulled armoured vessels, still with regular steam power, and that's pretty much par for the course as you go through most of the latter part of the 19th century. Steel starting to come in the 1880s and then in 1890s. Engines going from single expansion to double expansion to triple expansion. And then as you get the advances into Harvey steel and Krupp steel for face-hardened armors, then ships which have gradually been getting lower and lower freeboards, if they're protected, now can have much higher freeboards because the armor weighs less. At roughly the same time, metallurgical and propellant advances allow you to have longer barreled, smaller guns, as opposed to extremely large short barrel weapons. Then in the mid-1900s, you get the turbine, shortly followed by the geared turbine, and at that stage it's just a series of improvements in the power density of your boilers and the power capacity of your turbines and propeller shafts, and ever increasing sizes of gun. And from about 1910 onwards, there's just a direct expansion path towards what will eventually become the Iowas. Fechtler's Fictile Fettler, fourth finest Fettler forged for foreign fictile fettling forays, asks, can you take a few minutes and talk about your favourite Kreigsmarine Wunderwaffe? I think for the Kreigsmarine, my favourite Wunderwaffe, if you like, would probably be this thing. This is a 30cm rocket launcher array that was fitted and test fired both from the surface and underwater on board the U-511. The reason why I find this highly amusing is because it is in and of itself a thoroughly impractical and stupid weapon, but also led to an even more thoroughly and impractically stupid weapon, but also, weirdly, despite both projects being thoroughly impractical and stupid, actually in some ways set the basis for the far more practical and far more worrying ballistic missile submarines of the Cold War. So let me explain. Someone came up with the idea of, can you fire rockets underwater? And they built this heavy rocket array. First, they tested the rocket array itself, both on the surface and underwater, and then they strapped it to U-511 and told it to fire some on the surface, dive to periscope depth, dive a bit further, and it turns out that actually, yes, you could. The only problem being that, of course, you'd have to preset the launch angle, so your range was fixed. You'd have to hope the U-boat was fairly stable. And then at the end of the day, what exactly was the purpose of this? Yes, you could fit a lot of them on a U-boat. It would make it fairly high drag, but ultimately, if you're going for some kind of short bombardment mission, didn't make much odds. Apparently, there was some thoughts about maybe trying to fit some kind of guidance system to take out escorts, but that died off very quickly, almost immediately, when someone pointed out, well, we don't actually have anti-ship seeker warheads for, anything at that point. Because things like the HS-293 and the Fritz X, they needed to be guided by a launch vehicle, and, well, I don't need to really explain how stupid it would be to surface near an escort to try and volley fire rockets at it, because, well, then the escort can shoot back at you, and so can all its friends. And even as a short bombardment weapon, I mean, yes, there could be a modicum, given the range of these things, several miles, there could be a modicum of utility in sneaking up on enemy coastal installations and then shelling them, which you couldn't do with the surface Kriegsmarine, or rocketing them, I suppose. But despite the relative accuracy of these rockets, the simple fact is that you've got a very high drag, very noisy submarine. still approaching to within fairly close distance of presumably harbours or factories, which are going to have all sorts of anti-submarine measures in place, mines, nets, and of course anti-submarine warfare vessels, who will almost certainly pick you up and kill you. And if they don't, well, an extended firing barrage of rockets emerging from the water is a fairly big marker to say that there's something down here. Maybe coastal command aircraft or something should drop a depth charge or two on it. So, it's one of those, on paper, yes, there is potential utility, but in practice, it's a very expensive and intricate way of getting a submarine killed. And the reason I say it led to an even more hilariously stupid weapon, because it then kind of led to the idea of, let's make a gigantic capsule that can be towed by a submarine over to the US, where we will then flood the tail end of said capsule, so it's pointing vertically, and inside said capsule, somehow, surviving intact during the entire transatlantic crossing, will be a V2 missile, which we will then load with its liquid fuel and hope that, as I said, absolutely everything is still intact. So when we press the ignition switch, hopefully the V2 will fly out of said container and go sailing off towards an American city, presumably loaded with something a little bit more effective than just a ton of explosive. And yeah, I mean, given the propensity of V2s to fail or explode on launch when they were very carefully moved from their storage facility to the launch pad, I can only imagine what kind of stuff would be knocked loose being stuck in a watertight capsule and towed across the Atlantic. I suppose there is a small advantage at that point in that it is in a capsule, which means when it explodes, hopefully, if you're the U-boat crew, you're far enough away you don't get taken out by it. But there you go. But yeah, the reason I kind of like it is it's hilarious, but also once details of those experiments became known, in some ways they were a kind of early indicator of, as I said before, ballistic missile subs, although it did take people a considerably longer time to figure out how to safely launch rocketry from submarines underwater with a degree of accuracy. Prosiantike asks, I've gotten into discussions with people about writing about naval battles for alternate history scenarios, and it seems like the only acceptable depiction is a long, slugging match, whereas anything akin to a flagship detonating like Hood or a crippling sudden strike like the Battle of Cape Matapan immediately riles everyone up about unrealistic or biased depictions that don't reflect the true capabilities of a ship, even though there were many notable instances of exactly this kind of thing happening historically. So when it comes to depictions of fictional naval battles, where would you draw the line when it comes to plausibility? So I would follow the following process. Is the thing that's being described physically possible? So at the range that the fight is being depicted at, with the capabilities of the weapons and the protection being depicted, could such a thing actually happen? Then the next stage is, okay, if it could happen at that range, then how likely is it that that scenario would actually come into being? And this, I think, has two flavors to it. Firstly, just generally speaking in naval history, how likely is this kind of thing to actually happen? Has it happened before? Can you point to examples? And secondly, how has it been depicted? What has presumably the side that's winning by very rapidly disabling or crippling a ship, what have they done in order to facilitate this? And I suppose to a certain extent, what has the other side done or not done to allow this to happen? So if you're going to depict, for example, oh well, the other side is just supremely overconfident or despises their opponents, looks down on them, so they completely underestimate them and allow them to get far too close to do some crippling damage or whatever, I don't think that's very good writing generally, because even when you had, factions that absolutely hated and despised each other, like, well, the British and the French in any number of conflicts, but let's take the Napoleonic conflict, because you've got very patriotic, very monarchist British officers versus very patriotic, very anti-monarchist French officers, plus the whole Britain-France thing. Even then, the number of times you get, an aristocratic British officer looking down on the Frenchman going, oh, yes, well, stupid Frenchmen, they can't do anything to us. I know, why are they right next to us? What's going on? Why are we all on fire? Basically, essentially almost doesn't ever happen. So writing in a critical part of your story that something like that happens, at that point it feels like either very lazy writing, you're just trying to make an excuse for that to happen, or you personally have something against that particular nation and you're just trying to stick it to them, which again is poor writing in my mind. Whereas if your opponent ship is depicted as at least semi-competent, but you've used either extreme capability on the part of the point of view ship or some kind of technological advantage like radar in order to accomplish something, that is a lot more plausible and a lot more fair. So if we assume that it is physically capable of happening and that it has been set up by writing in a way that is relatively plausible, then the next thing would be, okay, well, what is the purpose of essentially cutting short the fight? Is it essentially just because you want to get it over and done with? Is it because you just really want to take out an opponent's ship, which again could verge towards lazy or biased writing? Or is it because there's some grander thing going on the plot that for the main character or the main ship to survive, you have to wrap this bit up fairly quickly? So for example, if you're going to do a golden BB shot like with Hood versus Bismarck, if you said, okay, well, we've been, as our point of view ship, we've been ambushed or we've run into in some way, shape or form 2 enemy ships, and you run the whole thing as we're doomed, we're probably not going to make it, we might get captured, we might get destroyed, we're massively outgunned, actually show the stakes, and you think, and then there you go, oh, well, we're going to take as much of the enemy down with us as possible, kind of last stand situation, and then after a few salvos, fate or whatever blesses you with a lucky shot, and boom goes the enemy. So it's now a 1v1 with the other ship, which you could potentially win, or something along those lines. It doesn't necessarily have to be a 2v1. It could be a time constraint, a minefield, the approach of enemy aircraft, or whatever. That is, from a narrative perspective, a much stronger thing than, oh, I just want this enemy ship to explode so we can move along with the plot. And also, how common is this? Is it a one and done and everyone on the ship's like, oh, wow, that's amazing, we didn't expect that to happen, fantastic, great, we can do something else now? Or is it, oh yes, well, this just shows how much better we are than everybody else, so ha ha ha, which is terrible. So yeah, those would be my general guidelines. And if you want an example of how not to do a short, sharp battle rather than a long slugging match, then to take, well, I wouldn't even encourage you to buy it because it's so terribly written in from that perspective, but perhaps look up excerpts of Harry Harrison's Stars and Stripes Forever, where you get an execrable scene of U.S.S. Monitor sailing up to HMS Warrior and blowing through her citadel with its 11-inch Dahlgrens and crippling steering and all of this. And I'm sitting there and going, yeah, at this point you just have an axe to grind against the Royal Navy, because it fails every single one of the tests we just described. It's physically impossible. At the time the confrontation takes place, the Dahlgrens do not have the power, even if you stuck the muzzle up against Warrior's hull, to actually blow through her armor protection. And even beyond that, Warrior's steering gear is below the waterline. And if you look at Monitor, she don't have that much in the way of gun depression either. And then also, how is Warrior even getting there in the first place? Now, how is Monitor getting there in the first place? Warrior is the faster ship. Warrior is a deep water ship. She's going to be hanging around offshore. She's not going to be right up close where you could get up that close and personal without massive incompetence. on the part of Warrior. And even if somehow Monitor was getting that close, Warrior could just move away. You know, the whole thing, when you read it, and to be honest, most of the tone of most of the rest of the book basically reads more like, I have this preconceived notion that I want the Union to beat the British Empire and therefore the Royal Navy, and I'm going to set it in obviously the period of the U.S. Civil War, and I don't care how ham-fisted, how stupid, or how unrealistic I have to make it. I'm just going to make it happen. And as a result, it's an absolutely terrible battle scene and a terrible way to do things. Now, there are, in theory, some ways, very few, but some ways where you could get a monitor, either USS Monitor or a group of monitors, to possibly cause Warrior trouble. But that would require actually engaging brain for more than 5 seconds. So, and yeah, I think that's where I start to have real objections, is where someone wants to put in something very implausible but hasn't actually put the work in to explain why this implausible thing has occurred. They've just hand-waved it. HMAS Albatross asks, Hi Drac, I have another question about something Friedman mentions in his book on British cruisers of the two World Wars and beyond. I believe at a few points when he's describing the design process of cruisers for the treaty cruisers, getting greater speed in a design on the target displacement by using destroyer machinery is considered. So what makes destroyer machinery of the period so different compared to what was the standard used in cruisers? Is it just size? Were there drawbacks in using it? Was it less reliable? Did it have a shorter lifespan, or something else? So there are two main issues with using destroyer machinery in a cruiser or cruiser machinery in a battleship, or destroyer machinery in a battleship. And yes, battleships with cruiser or destroyer type machinery were occasionally suggested as well. And that is that destroyer type machinery is generally optimized and assumed that it will be running at very high RPM a lot of the time, with relatively small propeller shafts and relatively small propellers, in part just because the whole machinery is very lightweight, and therefore you would have really weird torque issues with a really big heavy propeller shaft attached to a really lightweight turbine, for instance. And of course that's because destroyers are expected to spend a lot more of their time operating at high speed, so the machinery plant is optimized for that, whereas the bigger a ship gets, the more it's likely to be operating for extended periods of time at lower speeds, and therefore, one, the machinery is less likely to be as efficient, and two, well, things can break because they're being used in a non-optimal manner, which makes them less reliable. But also, more generally, the heavier grades of machinery used in cruisers and in battleships are just essentially more heavily built. There's more redundancies in them, therefore they weigh more. But because weight is slightly less of a concern in those larger ships, it is slightly less of an issue generally, unless of course you're building up to a treaty limit. But that means that in turn larger ship machinery will tend to be more reliable because it can take more stress, and if something does go slightly wrong, just generally it will be able to cope with that a bit more, with, say, more redundancies, and in some cases also just being physically larger. And that of course means that if you are a battleship or an aircraft carrier or a big cruiser and you're potentially out on deployment for months at a time, refueling at sea and so forth, this is good. Your machinery plant will keep going. Whereas a destroyer, at least in the era before extensive at-sea refueling, would be expected to be at sea for maybe a few days, maybe a week or so at most, in most circumstances outside of convoy escort duty. And therefore, the fact that the machinery is slightly less reliable, slightly more prone to breakdown, is not as much of a problem, because let's say you would expect major issues to crop up with destroyers machinery about 3 to 4 weeks, in about 3 to 4 weeks of continuous running. Well, that's not a problem because the destroyer doesn't have enough fuel to run for 3 or 4 weeks constantly, and therefore every time the destroyer comes back from a mission, the machinery can be shut down, general maintenance can be done, and you reset the clock on most of those issues. Whereas if you stick your lightweight destroyer machinery in a cruiser, not only do you have the mismatch of intended use and size of propellers and everything, and obviously, sticking a really heavy propeller and shaft on a lightweight turbine, as we said, would have its own problems, but also that cruiser might be out at sea for 2 or 3 months, at which point halfway through you might start to have some rather significant breakdowns, which could happen at exactly the wrong time. If you like, a very crude way of looking at it would be that, as well as being lighter, destroyer machinery is run a lot closer to tolerance because of that shorter maintenance cycle. In much the same way as, you look at the, for example, jet and rocket engines used in modern cruise missiles, for instance. The simple fact is that if you took let's say the jet engine that you might find in a modern cruise missile, and you ran it for 50 hours, it would almost certainly have destroyed itself by that point. But nobody cares, because a cruise missile engine at best is going to run for a few hours before the whole missile destroys itself. But that's why you can't use that particular engine, despite the fact it's very small, compact, lightweight and high power, in an aircraft, because an aircraft tends to want to fly for a bit longer than a couple of dozen hours before it tears itself to pieces. Or perhaps a slightly less martial example, compare a Formula One racing car engine to a similar power output engine perhaps found in a big rig, or a lorry or a truck, depending on your linguistics. One is much smaller and lighter weight than the other, but one requires maintenance after a single race, whereas the other is supposed to chug along for thousands or tens of thousands of miles between significant maintenance. And finally, for this half, Moonsquire asks, I was reading about the 10th Cruiser Squadron using outdated ships of the Edgar class. The squadron intercepted many neutral vessels heading to Germany. Can you give some greater detail about them and how they were doing important blockade work? And incidentally, some more detail on Admiral Dudley Duchaire. A name like that ranks up there with Manly Power. Separate as ancillary question that Moonsquire asked about December Patreon question on Tora. I've moved that over to the live stream that's due for that particular month's questions, mostly because I need to rewatch Tora to answer it. So the Edgar class were essentially a kind of budget cruiser for the late 1880s. They built Blake and Blenheim and then gone, they're good, but they're kind of a bit too big and expensive. So you could view them as kind of, they're kind of the Fiji or Crown Colony class as compared to the Town class, I would say. Now, the reason they were on 10th Cruiser Squadron doing blockade work in the early part of the war was simply because they were still in service, but they were not in any way, shape or form capable of serving with the main fleet in their original role, because their maximum speed was around about 20 knots. So they were actually slightly slower than the Grand Fleet's battleships, the Dreadnought battleships at least. And, well, they were also protected cruisers. They had no belt armor whatsoever. So you have these functional cruisers, and therefore, on paper, they look like the ideal ships to do blockade duty, because at 20 knots, they're still faster than pretty much any merchant ship. They've got a fairly heavy armament of 2 9.2 inch for most of them, and a bunch of 6-inch guns. So even if there are a few ships out there that are somewhat faster than it, they can cripple or sink them before they get out of range. They're cruisers, so they're designed for long-range patrols, and they're almost 8,000 tons, so they should be relatively seaworthy as well. So theoretically, perfect blockade ships. Unfortunately, they were also 2 to 2.5 decades old at the time, and they had been fairly heavily used in their early service careers, so their machinery was often in absolutely terrible condition, which meant reliability, fuel consumption and top speed were all massively down on what their on-paper capabilities were, and the area that the blockade duty was assigned was actually quite stormy. Now, to be fair, that stormy weather would be a problem for pretty much any ship. You know, an 8,000-ton protected cruiser should be able to handle most weather conditions. The fact that they almost came a cropper in some of the storms is more a reflection on exactly how bad the storms were than on their size and capacity in and of itself. But the machinery was a really big problem, and so they ended up with 10, 12, 15 knots top speed depending on the ship, using a whole lot more coal. So a ship might be able to only make 12 or 13 knots, but would consume more coal than it would fresh out of the dockyards running at 20. And as a result, they often couldn't actually stay out on patrol anywhere near as long as was hoped. And with blockade duty being a fairly relentless task, that only exacerbated the machinery issues. So a combination of said machinery issues, fuel consumption, reliability, and the fact that one of them got themselves torpedoed by the U-9, the same submarine that sank Aboukir, Hogue, and Cressy, meant that although they did really good and valuable duty in the early part of the blockade, the first sort of half year or so, they were recalled for paying off, for the crews moved off to other ships, and eventually a mostly armed merchant cruisers were used on blockade duty instead. And as for Admiral Duchaire, or more accurately, Admiral Sir Dudley Rawson Stratford de Chair, well, he was rather complicated in terms of ancestry, as you might anticipate from that surname. He was actually originally descended from French Huguenots who'd moved to England. They had then subsequently moved to Canada, and then this particular iteration of the de Chairs had moved back to England, whereupon Dudley had enlisted in the Royal Navy, which meant that he actually saw action at the bombardment of Alexandria in the flagship HMS Alexandra, adjacent to Captain Fisher aboard the Inflexible. But by the 1900s, his career had advanced to being a captain, so he was captain of the armoured cruiser HMS Cochrane towards the end of the 1900s. Then he went on for a period of shore-based roles, including serving as a naval attaché to the King. Then promoted to flag rank a couple of years before World War I. Apparently had a bit of a run-in with Winston Churchill, which meant he was then given command of the 10th Cruiser Squadron, which was made up of the old Edgars as opposed to a more active frontline squadron. And then he supervised the blockade of Germany for the first couple of years, then moved ashore briefly, then got a frontline command with 3rd Battle Squadron, but a year after the Battle of Jutland, so didn't manage to see any major action there. And then after a short period post-war supervising the distribution of German and Austro-Hungarian warships, he went off to become governor of New South Wales for the majority of the 1920s before retiring. And that brings to an end the first half of the Patreon Drydock for this month. Thank you very much for listening, and on to part 2.